Ladies and gentlemen, today's program is about to begin. We ask that you please put your phones and mobile devices on silent. This program is being filmed. The full program will be streaming live on labusinesscouncil.org, and portions of the program will air on Channel 35. Don't forget to use today's summit hashtag LABC Summit. Welcome to the 2018 Mayoral Housing, Transportation, and Jobs Summit. To begin our program, please welcome Interim Dean of the UCLA Anderson School of Management, Al Osborne, Jr.
Good morning, everybody. And let me add a warm welcome to those of you who had to, how do I say this, fight through the Los Angeles traffic to get here this morning. We hope that one of the issues we all have a chance to deal with in this great forum is what to do with transportation in the city before it strangles all of us. But really, welcome here. This is, I can't believe this, the 17th year in which the Mayoral Housing and Transportation Jobs Summit has been held on this campus. And it is really nice to be able to do it in a facility such as what we have here at Luskin. And we're delighted on behalf of UCLA and the Anderson School to not only welcome you, but wish you a good day of innovative thinking and challenging to some of the best and most creative panelists that's been assembled for this kind of activity. But that doesn't surprise me. LABC, under the strong leadership of Mary Leslie, has done an amazing job of keeping us focused on the larger issues and the context in which we need to deal. And before I say a few more remarks, I really want to give a shout out to all of the special guests who are here who have taken time out of their schedule to be here. I know Attorney General Xavier Becerra will close out the event, but in the meantime, we have senators and assemblymen, Senator Wiener, Assemblymember Chu, Speaker Pro Tem Friedman here, and of course the Secretary of California Transportation, Brian Annis, and the Chief Planner for the city, Vince Bertoni. The mayor is expected to be here. This is his conference, and I'm glad that his presence will give us the set of priorities as we host this. But it's appropriate that this be held in a university because the foundation of all wealth somehow traces itself, unless it's inherited, to education. And universities, therefore, is an important link, I believe, in providing what that is, because there is a correlation between education, jobs, and unemployment, or employment, as you may want to look at it. And UCLA alone, for example, has its own impact in this city when it comes to jobs. I was reading the UCLA economic report in preparation for these remarks. The campus totals a little bit over $11 billion in addition to the UCLA economy, and $4 billion of that occurs right here in the city of Los Angeles. So education and jobs go well together, and we got to worry about how we deal with that, and I know it's on your agenda. But affordability and homes also are part of all of it, and I've seen that the agenda includes many experts talking about that. I really think that tied to that is the whole issue of homelessness, which to me is one of the thorniest challenges I think the region faces. And it seems to me I see every day more and more people who really, for no fault of their own, except that they live from week to week with income or have had challenges with health and narcotics and other issues, find themselves living under bridges or, in many cases, different parts of this very university. So unsheltered people in Los Angeles, the highest are in the state of California, 75%. Among the homeless, 73% is here. I said 75, I meant 73 in Los Angeles, whereas in California it's like half that, maybe 35. 35, 6, no, well, let me get my numbers right. 68 for California and 35 for the nation. We really have to do something. Now, we know everybody wants to live in LA, but, you know, it's not neat to have them all living under bridges or in aisles. And we need for folks to to get beyond that. So the bottom line is we hope that we can do something about that. And I'm glad, therefore, that the dialogue continues and UCLA can be a host for all of that. So I thank you for your presence. As my friend Dick Ziman might see, I take my hat off to you for bothering to be here to really continue the conversation, because nothing happens and you don't have impact unless you have people with voices, intelligent voices that have done their homework and have dared to talk with one another in conversations that hopefully a dialogue that can lead to solutions. So I congratulate you for being here, and I wish those of you who are leading these panels to challenge each other have a very productive day. And thank you for being on the UCLA campus.
Please now welcome to the stage Richard Ziman, founding chair of the Los Angeles Business Council.
Thank you, Al. Al Osborne is a fixture here at UCLA. He's an institution, and for him to share a few minutes with us this morning, Al, thank you. And Al does know about all the issues concerning Los Angeles, having been long time committed and so deeply involved. And as we heard, he's the acting dean of the Anderson School of Management. And I want to thank also the entire UCLA team, the team at Anderson, and especially the team at UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. On behalf of the LABC, Los Angeles Business Council, and the Los Angeles Business Council Institute, I'd like to welcome you all formally to the 2018 Mayoral Housing, Transportation, and Jobs Summit. We have a great program today, a terrific program, and I'm excited to see all of you here and the last people that will fill in shortly. For 17 years, this summit has been a platform for new ideas to be announced, partnerships to be made, and the impact of future housing affordability, transportation accessibility, and job creation here in Los Angeles and the state of California. Today, we continue with our tradition of a great lineup of speakers highlighted by our own mayor, Eric Garcetti. We also have Attorney General, as you heard, Javier Becerra, Director of the California State Transportation Agency, Brian Annis, and executives from JPMorgan Chase, Holland Partner Group, Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, McKinsey Global Institute, and many, many more. We're going to hear how businesses need to incorporate the cost of housing in their business strategy to maintain competitiveness. We're going to have a panel of housing experts to discuss and show how the state can take a leadership role in meeting California's demand, and this is the number, 3.5 million new housing units by 2025, merely 7 years from now, and how several November ballot measures are going to impact that goal. Public and private officials will strategize also on ways to leverage the Metro's $120 billion investment in transit to address housing, economic development, and transit equity. And finally, we're going to talk about the impact of the our electrified future on jobs and as well as our economy. A major thank you to our premier sponsors who made this summit possible: Bank of America, California Community Foundation, Energy Foundation, JPMorgan Chase, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation, and Wells Fargo, as well as our gold and silver sponsors. Thank you, thank you, thank you. How about a little bit of an applause? I also want to shout out for Mary Leslie again. She has been a great leader of the Los Angeles Business Council and the Los Angeles Business Institute. She not only crystallizes and puts in front of all of us these so crucial issues, but she looks for ways to resolve them, to execute, and that's most important, and that's what's in front of us for the entire day today. And I'd also like to thank the entire LABC staff for doing a terrific job year after year, for putting in countless hours and putting this and so many other of our programs together. Before we proceed, I would also like to acknowledge those who have made special contributions to our community and the entire Los Angeles region. Last night, at the Summit VIP reception, LABC awarded several individuals and organizations for their outstanding work to address housing, transportation, and economic issues here in Los Angeles. I'd like to recognize LA County Supervisor Janice Hahn, Chairman, is she here? Not yet? Okay. Chairman and CEO Related California, Bill Whitty, and the team of Councilmember David Rue, Sarah Dussault, Vice Chairman of the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority, Tom Safran and Associates, the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department, and the Los Angeles LGBT Center. We're also honored to have with us today LA City Councilman Mike Bonin and Paul Koretz, and the Mayor of Culver City, Tom Small. Thank you to all of our honorees who have brought so much to the LA area. Thank you. As founding chair of the LABC, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, who will be sharing the Institute's newest report, The Affordable Housing Crisis in Los Angeles, Impacts to LA's Fastest Growing Industries. That's the title, very key, very important for us. Last year, the LABC released the first phase of this research report with Dr. Raphael Bostic of USC, who is now president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, who surveyed LA's major employers to address the impact of the high cost of housing on employee attraction and, importantly, retention. The second phase dives deeper into this issue, analyzing LA's fastest growing industries and surveying 18 employers representing over 84,000 employees on how they're feeling the impact of LA's lack of affordable housing is hitting us. If there's one consistent message from this report, it's that companies who want to be successful and want to be competitive here in Los Angeles must consider their employees' housing costs in their business strategy. We look forward to hearing Dr. Painter's recommendations on the role of the employers and the public sector can play. You can find the executive summary of the report in your program today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Painter. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Dean Osborne already mentioned thanking you for braving the traffic. I think that's one of the things that in some sense motivates a report like this one. And I actually thought about not even putting slides up here today and just kind of had a brief conversation about the issues, and then you can dive deep into the report. But I'll put a few slides up here just as we kind of walk through this morning. I think what we wanted to do a few things, recognizing kind of the increasing strains that Angelenos are facing, right? And we wanted to document some of these things. So these are facts that I think everyone knows, but are worth kind of starting with. What we know is that while nationwide 21 million people spend more than 30% of their income on housing cost or rent, here in Los Angeles, it's a much more constrained story. What we've seen over the last decade or so is that up from 52.6%, now 56% of residents spend more than 30% of their income as rent, and nearly a third pay more than 50% of their income as rent. So far, I think most people have recognized these data, appreciate these data, but I think the story that we found in terms of in the data is that these strains just keep building. And where is it going to end is the open question, and where the system really starts to feel overall big strains. And we got some of that information in our survey of the employers as well. And so we wanted to understand these three questions in the report. We wanted to know what effect the higher cost of living is having on businesses and employers. We want to know how this is affecting both employers and employees. How are they coping with housing affordability? And then finally, what can employers do to assist employees in reducing these housing cost burdens? And so we started off by just looking at what are the sources of this increasing rent burden. And what you see in these data, which are somewhat small, but just to give you a sense, is on the top panel, what we have is the house prices for owner-occupied housing. On the bottom, the light blue is the rental price. What you see that even though you see the kind of run up and then the downturn in house prices, and if we had extended the data to the present, you know that in many neighborhoods, we've now reached the peak again. Rents never did go down. Rents continued to climb throughout the past decade, whether we were in a recession or not. And incomes have been relatively flat. So that's why the 52% went up to the 56%. What's interesting, and again, shows the strains that are there, if you look overall in terms of commute times, it's just been a slow, steady increase for people getting to their jobs. So is 2 minutes a lot? Is 3 minutes a lot? Is 4 minutes a lot? It turns out if everybody in the region is taking 3 to 4 or 5 minutes longer to get to work, it adds up to a lot of lost productivity in the region. And what's especially interesting is that we saw post-recession that if people are choosing to be a homeowner, they're more likely to have a longer commute because they're having to choose to be a homeowner even further away from where they work than before. And so again, if you think about the stresses on individuals and families, we need to figure out a way to cope with that or deal with those stresses in ways that are going to increase not the overall quality of life, which certainly includes wages and lower housing costs, but it includes the overall quality of life as well. One way to kind of demonstrate these increasing commutes is to focus on, and as Dick Ziman said, we focused on the fastest growing industries. And so we identified the clusters where fastest growing industries are located. And not surprisingly, downtown is a cluster for actually all the fastest growing industries. And so just as an example, and we kind of trace this through in the report for all these other industries, what you can see with the colors, right? Darker colors mean more people are living in those particular regions of Los Angeles and commute to downtown, right? So in 2005, which is your left, you can see where those colors are, and really in a real simple way, what you see is, out into the Santa Clarita Valley and further east, there's many more people living now that work in downtown, right? And that's why you see those commute times going up and your traffic costs and all of those kinds of things. And so what we wanted to do is to say, okay, everyone seems to recognize these facts. You feel it every day as you get on the freeway. Those strains, the people that you talk to, you hear the story over and over again. We've now documented that story. Well, what are employers seeing in terms of their own ability to retain and hire workers? And what kinds of strains are their employees sharing with them? So we did an employer survey throughout the region of these three industries, and at a very high level, we're going to call them in the report healthcare, accommodation and food service, and then professional, scientific, and technical services. The last category you might just imagine as kind of the knowledge economy jobs in that space. And then the other two are kind of just our bread and butter, like things that drive the region. And healthcare, although it's also one of the largest industries, continues to be fast growing because of the demands for healthcare. And so the way that we ended up kind of interacting with the employers is first kind of get a sense of what they felt was going on. And what emerged was a clear consensus that the high cost of housing was in fact affecting employee recruitment and retention. But what we saw is that in the professional scientific services, the issues were more on recruitment. So they had to pay higher amounts of money to get people to come to the region who were from outside to bring in the knowledge that they had into the region. And because either they were going to have to live further away or pay higher rents close to the workplace, right? The industries in health and the industries in accommodation, which continue to be engines of growth here in Los Angeles, they were observing much more turnover than they had a decade ago. And so there's different kinds of costs that are happening. They weren't paying people a lot more. They were able to find workers. But as you know, in your own businesses, turnover costs. And if you can think of strategies to reduce turnover, that's perhaps as equally beneficial as strategies which involve paying people more and in different ways. So that's something to really keep in mind. And so those workers, especially at the median or below median kind of level in terms of wages, those are especially strained. So when they had to move out further to pay the rent, then they were then immediately start looking for jobs closer to home, right? It makes sense. And they may not find them, but then if they're having to travel, the strains increase. So these are all things that are really, really important. So then we asked employers, well, what's happening? What are you doing about it? What's going on? And so what we found was that 61% of respondents have not done anything to assist their employees in reducing these housing cost debts. So they knew it was a problem, but they hadn't done anything about it. For those that had done something about it, most of them included programs around home buyer education, relocation assistance, mortgage assistance, financial education, and those kinds of things. And then we found that 57% were also unaware that there were any programs out there from either nonprofit organizations or public organizations. So, there was clearly a knowledge gap among employers writ large. And these employers, again, represent, engines of growth here in the economy, and part of that might be they're just moving so fast just to kind of keep up with their own demand and growth. But not even knowing what's out there is really a knowledge gap that may be closed immediately. But thinking more creatively about how you actually reduce burdens for your employees is clearly going to be essential going forward. So just the key takeaways, high level, what's going on. The data suggests there is a need for intervention. The increasing strains that are facing workers do affect the region's economy. I wrote a paper with Stuart Gabriel, who is the director of the Ziman Center, titled Why Affordability Matters. What we found in the research is that it increases the impact of negative economic shocks when you have these increasing cost burdens and increasing inequality. And that's something that we have to prepare for here in Los Angeles. And we don't want to be a place where we have higher and higher volatility. We want to take advantage of the diversity we have so that we can weather those shocks when they will come. And as I said, and just in terms of key takeaways, again, the last line, just to highlight it once again, we know in the last decade commute times increased, and for renters, increases in housing costs clearly outpaced increases in wages. And I think just for sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead. So we decided to do a few case studies. Like, what are some exemplars that actually show some promise? Like, what kind of new partnerships, what kind of creative thinking on the side of employers actually is making a dent? And how did employers approach this question differently in different ways? And so we looked at two developments here in Los Angeles, the Taylor Yard Transit Village, the Martin Expo Town Center, and then we also looked at what Seattle was doing in their variety of programs on affordability and livability. Today I'm just going to talk briefly about the Taylor Yard Transit Village program. Most of you are somewhat familiar with it. Here are some details for those of you that aren't. There's 400 housing units in this, approximately 30,000 square feet of retail space, and 2.5 acres of open space across a total plot of 16.3 acres. This is a public-private partnership. So this involved Metro's joint development program. And when you kind of dig down into the details, there are some hints of things that could be explored much more widely. One of the things that happened in this is that Metro was able to extend ground leases in ways that made it more profitable for developers to partner. So it's kind of just like one of these little things, moving from a 66-year ground lease to a 99-year lease, actually provides the kind of certainty that made a difference for the developers here. There was some creativity in this and the other case study around how you looked at affordability and the placement of affordability, so that you didn't have to necessarily, if you're looking at a mixed income community, you didn't have to have a mixed income building, but you could have an affordable building right next to a building that was market rate. And if it was more profitable to develop in that manner, as opposed to kind of have the mixed within a single site, then that could actually be a way forward. And there's many other kinds of creative solutions that happened in these. On the downside, these creative solutions did not come at cost. As you're trying to demonstrate kind of this new ideas, it takes a long time to get all the partnerships together and the stakeholders together to kind of see what happens. And so we hope that some of these become models for how the business community can get involved in partnership when there is, opportunity, especially as we do leverage these transit investments really carefully. Our recommendations fall into two categories. One is for the employers and one is for policymakers. So here are a few of them. I think it's pretty clear from the survey that you need to think of housing as part of your overall business strategy as an employer. You need to think about the local housing costs when deciding employee compensation packages. You know, just think about it as a line item in the benefit package and kind of what would that mean? Would employees be willing to trade off some more stability with housing for wages in different ways, right? What would be the right mix there? And what we see is that there are some models out there in terms of employer-assisted housing programs, but we need to kind of explore those more deeply and to see what might be most effective in that space. You need to craft creative solutions, and this is already happening, around kind of flexible work times and so forth so that you can reduce those commute cost burdens. And then certainly leverage corporate and philanthropic support to support affordable housing. And this is work that the Center for Social Innovation that I direct is doing with a variety of people to think about what kind of new models could be actually proposed and implemented that could provide opportunity for-profit developers to partner directly with philanthropy in ways that hasn't happened, whereas it has happened in the nonprofit development sector. So I think there's some solutions out there, and we just need to be dedicated to finding them. A couple other things. One of them is in one of the cases, there was a clear vocal proponent in the political process to advocate for that housing. So one way to turn NIMBY into YIMBY is when businesses step up and say, we need this housing for our employees, and you want the jobs in the community, we need this housing for our employees. It's not other people that are moving in, it's your community that's going to be living here and wanting to stay here. And we saw that that was essential in moving that process forward. And we've seen in other parts of the country that a lot of times employers will make some guarantees to enter into a master lease agreement on new properties and existing properties to say, we're committed to make sure that we want our employees here. And we're going to lease at least this many units among our employees. So those kinds of things provide certainty on the development side that may not have existed before, and I think that's really important as well. Finally, for the public agencies, I think some of these solutions are already out there in the conversation, but I think the evidence in the research suggests that we really need to kind of take those steps. And I know this panel and some of the next panels are going to be really talking deeply about these. How can we think about different ways to subsidize affordable housing? While we listed here discounted ground leases, extending duration of ground leases, tax abatement programs, et cetera, I've been in conversations with people in the city in particular, both in Long Beach and in Los Angeles, about opportunity zones, right? Opportunity zones are out there. How do we actually, in the term I like to use, how do you activate the subsidy of the opportunity zone effectively, right? Because the capital can flow where the capital is going to flow. And if the cities certainly want to be part of an overall planning strategy, well, how can you activate that strategy? How can you partner with it, either bringing together some of these ideas, but also to make the commitments for the longer-term affordability in a way that makes sense for everybody? So to kind of think creatively along those ways. There's different ways to think about permanent revenue streams to finance these things, thinking about how to use, when you do collect linkage fees, how does that get streamlined back into the process? And absolutely, there have been examples about how to activate the subsidy, if you will, in looking at permanent supportive housing here in Los Angeles and streamlining that process. So can we extend that in other places? So, with that, I don't think there's any time for questions for me, but I know that I'm sure John will tee up the next panel to ask the questions that will provide some of the answers as we move forward. So if you have questions for me afterwards, I'll be around the room and I'll be happy to chat with you further. So thank you very much.
On stage now is today's first panel, How Can Employers Address the High Cost of Housing for Their Employees? John E. Kobara, COO of the California Community Foundation, is your panel moderator.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And want to just shout out to Mary Leslie and company at the LA Business Council who love what they're doing and supporting what they're doing and come to this summit every year. We also want to thank Gary for the report, provocative stuff. We kind of have to look in the mirror today and think about what we're all doing together and individually regarding these issues. What's going on? What's really happening? I mean, when you start to think about the complexity of housing, affordability, poverty in this community, I think about my two alma maters, UCLA and USC. I have other alma maters, but But both of them have food pantries now that are quite extensive for their students for food insecurity, and both of them now have homeless shelters on both of the campuses. There are now homeless shelters for the campuses of a number of schools in the region. As you know, 10% of all Cal State students are now homeless, and 7% of UC students. And we start to not understand what's really going on in terms of the bigger picture. When we look at the 53,000 that have been counted on the streets, which we see every day that are suffering out there, the 175,000 that had received homeless services in the last year, unique individuals, and the 600,000 people that are on the edge of homelessness. We look at the river of homelessness as the extreme of this thing. We start to look at food insecurity in this community, and CalFresh food stamps. This county is the 58th county in terms of participation in food stamps. We have the worst participation in food stamps in the state of California, and one of the worst in the state. Why does that matter? Because people aren't getting their benefits for a wide variety of reasons. But this county, LA County, the poorest county in the United States, is the only county in the state of California that has had no decline in eligibility in the last 3 years in food stamps. So you have a community that's going through a lot of challenges. And we've seen all the different things. I don't know if you've seen these videos now that are being posted to Fortune 100 companies of homeless employees that are not angry or even litigious. They're just saying, hey, I'm homeless. I work for you and I like working for you, but it's not enough. Or the poll that was done by Luskin, you know, out of the Luskin school here that showed that 33% of the people in LA that make between $75,000 and $90,000 are fearful of being homeless. It is a pervasive issue. It's not just about homelessness, but it's about us looking in the mirror. At CCF, we've had to think deeply about our own employees, about the benefits and services as a philanthropy organization, and we advise philanthropy organizations all through the region. We've told certain corporations that have the courage and interest that they should be doing an assessment of how many homeless are in their populations before they launch any large philanthropic initiatives. So it's about what's going on and how do we work together as a part of this process. So we've assembled a panel, a great panel, to start to answer some of the questions. I'm not sure we're going to have all the solutions. We have maybe some thoughts about what questions we should be raising amongst ourselves as employers. Jacqueline Waggoner is the Vice President of Enterprise Community Partners. Andy Ortiz is the Chief Human Relations Officer for Cedars-Sinai, and Gillian Wright is the Chief Human Relations Officer for Southern California Gas. So let's get to it. You've heard Dr. Painter's findings. We've looked at the report. How do you think the cost of housing is being dealt with right now and impacting employers in terms of retention, recruitment, of talent? And what are your organizations doing about it? Let's start with Jacqueline.
Well, good morning. Enterprise, our work, we've been at this for 36 years helping low-income people nationwide, and so we are committed to helping low-income people actually find housing and connect them to opportunities like good jobs, transportation, and schools, and so forth. And so we got in this space because we realized that our public agency partners and our politicals have done a really good job about passing Measure H. We have Proposition Triple H, we have the linkage fee, we have movement in renter protections and rent control. The reason being is that the systems that currently exist, such as low-income housing, tax credits, and other things, are not enough because we have so many impoverished people. And one of the things that we saw in Gary's work is that most people in the like tourism industry and other places are only making $25,000 a year, which equates to roughly $15 an hour. And we know that you need at least twice that to be housing secure. And so I think that the work of employers and other sectors is key to helping solve the crisis. And I know we opened up with talking about homelessness, and the reason why homelessness is such a challenge is because we have such a huge shortage of housing. I mean, I know you all know about the 500,000 units short, but we also saw in the recent homeless count that we're tracking in the right direction, that we see it starting to tick down. But if we don't catch the inflow of people falling into homelessness, we're going to continue to have the homelessness crisis that we have in the region. So we need to be more intentional about building more affordable housing and advancing policies. And employers can play a major role. I mean, employers often talk about the cost of health insurance for their employees. And a lot of people are sick because of stress, housing insecurity. They're strained. right? And so as employers think about investing in better health care, if the person is going to the doctor but living in their car, they're never going to get better. So what can employers think about in terms of using their underutilized space? Some of the programs that exist, they help people with mortgages, but mortgages, if the median household price is about $640,000, that means that they're only helping their high-wage workers. But what about the secretaries and the security guards that work for all of us that we all desperately need their support? And how can we think about subsidizing some of their income to help with their affordable housing? So I think we're on the right path. There's a lot more to do, and I think the reason why we started this research is to engage employers and maybe replicate some of those really strong models, like Taylor Yards using publicly owned land, or even looking at other deals on the west side where they're actually targeting housing people in the community.
So just one follow-up, and then we'll get to the other panelists. What's Enterprise doing in terms of making its own assessment, looking in the mirror of your own employees and thinking about their ability to be housing secure?
That's a good question, John. So we are digging in and looking at the stratosphere of our team members and seeing where they land on the payment scale. And even most recently, I was evaluating my staff and kind of looking at who potentially is housing insecure because of their wages, and how do we look at doing our part to make sure that we're not contributing to the problem. And so we're looking in the mirror. We just had a mass meeting where we're looking at all of our team members and make sure they're well paid and figuring out other things that we can do so that they can sustain themselves.
We'll have more time to talk more about that. Andy Ortiz.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. This is such an important topic at this time in our history. When I started working in human resources 30 years ago, I started doing that work because it was important for me to help create the best work environments for people so that people can deliver their best work. It's shocking to me that 30 years into this, now I'm talking about how to find people housing. And I never thought that that would be part of my job, but it is. So today at Cedars-Sinai, for instance, this is an issue. We have a work-life team that helps support our employees in a variety of different ways. If they have personal challenges, whatever that might be. And what we're finding is we're getting more and more calls, not just from new employees moving into the area, but from existing employees that are saying they're having difficulty finding affordable housing, and that people are having to live in their cars and get creative, join the YMCA so they can shower, or whatever it might be. So it is just interesting to me that we're here at this juncture having this conversation. The good news is we're having this conversation so that we can try to put our heads together and figure out what to do. For Cedars-Sinai, a few things that we've done just to build on some of the points that have already been made. One is, back about 5 years ago, we made a commitment to move all of our employees to the $15 an hour. That was the minimum wage that we would provide to our employees. So that was a commitment that we made, hoping that that would help. And certainly I know that that made a difference to many of our employees. We also, for difficult to find, world-class cancer physicians and cancer specialists and heart specialists, we do have a housing loan program that we offer to folks to help them find housing. But again, for most people, we still are in the situation where they're having to travel 90 minutes to 2 hours to get to work, and it contributes to the stress and the burnout, and certainly among healthcare workers, burnout is a very important big issue that we're facing.
So Andy, give us a little profile, dimensions of your employees in terms of Cedars-Sinai.
Yeah, so Cedars-Sinai, for those of you that don't know us, we're a 116-year-old nonprofit healthcare services organization. We're made up of our very large complex organization, our academic medical center located in Beverly Hills, West Hollywood neighborhood. We have a community hospital in Marina del Rey. We have a medical network made up of physicians and specialty doctors. We have an academic enterprise that does biomedical research. And we have 15,000 employees that work for Cedars-Sinai today. But at any given day, if you were to walk on the campus, the numbers, because of volunteers, because of private physicians, and our 15,000 employees, it's anywhere between 20 and 25,000 employees per day that are on the campus providing healthcare services. So when you think about, I try to think about housing not just for the 15, but for the 20 and 25,000 people. What are we doing for them, and the impact of the commute that's having on them, and ultimately having on all of our families. So when all of us in this room are sick, or we have a sick family member and they need help, we want those healthcare providers to show up awake and alert and well and energized to be able to help them solve problems, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to do that if people are worried about where they're living, or that they have to get on the road for a 2-hour commute.
Hard to really measure the psychological and mental impacts of some of these issues. Right. Gillian Wright from SoCalGas.
Well, it's an interesting contrast in scale. So just in listening to the scale of Cedars-Sinai, I don't think I even realized just how many people you pack into that relatively compact campus by comparison. SoCalGas serves the southern half of California, roughly. So we serve 6 million customers with just 7,600 employees, which sort of speaks to some of our opportunity and challenge. So in attracting and retaining employees, our challenge is a little more subtle because of the geographic breadth that we serve. So what we find is that it continues to be challenging to attract and retain and keep employees in the downtown and LA metro area. But we see a strong migration and pull towards the outer areas that we serve. So there's a strong movement of employees toward the eastern suburbs, San Bernardino and the Inland Empire, and up into some of the northern areas, Santa Clarita, Valencia, Palmdale. And then with longer and longer commutes for those that are working in the inner core. And the challenge that we find is in having people continually moving through those jobs in the inner core. But as an employer, we are also a service provider for an essential service that is also an important part of the cost of housing in Los Angeles and in the region. So we have to balance, and we do pay close attention to the wages that we pay. And in general, our wages, 90% of our employees are making more than $50,000 a year, and that includes close to 4,000 to 5,000 employees that are really non-degreed employees. There's no degree required. They're union represented positions. But we have to balance that against, we need to also manage the cost of the service we provide. And in the service that we provide, that is part of the cost of housing. We have the third lowest natural gas bills in the country, which is very, very important because electricity costs here are 50% higher than the rest of the country. So we provide a very important balance to that. And we have to continually judge and balance and look at, and what we really strive to do is to balance the cost of our operation and to manage the affordability, but not to do that on the backs of our employees, to ensure that we are providing well-paying jobs with strong career paths and really focusing on our retention of our employees. So we have, it's also a really important point of pride for us that we have not done layoffs of employees in over 20 years. We're very careful in our level of staffing, 7,600 people to serve half the state. In order to maintain that and to really provide the path of growth for those employees. So we can talk more about energy policy and its trajectory, but that is the lens and the focus that we put around it, is to look at how can we both achieve the state's goals and still maintain this focus on affordability, which is the most important element that our business and our residential customers highlight and what they value in our service.
Yes, thank you. That's an issue becomes more complex as we dig deeper into it. Let's shift gears a little bit. as of 2018, employees that earn less than $54,250 are eligible for low-income housing. And so not sure everybody is aware of that, not sure everybody utilizes that. What's your perception about that awareness, and what are you doing at your employers, if anything, to apprise employees of that opportunity? Who wants to go first? Anybody?
You want to speak to that one?
Andy, go.
I'm happy to jump in, sure. So we do, and again, the thing that is so interesting to me is how the world of work has changed. And so having to provide, it used to be the days where you would have to provide training to your employees on how to do their jobs and how to have them be effective in their roles. Now we have to provide education on where to find housing. So I mentioned that we have a work-life team that helps our employees with that. We do a fair amount of education to our employees to help them understand what it's like to live in the Los Angeles community, what are the resources that are available to them. So we do a fair amount of that, but I still think there's a lack of education, and certainly more that we can do. So much of what we do depends upon what's happening, every day in the medical center and the complexities, and so there's certainly more that we still can do. But that's why I'm here, to help listen and learn from everyone to see if there's any unique programs that we can think about at Cedars.
Gillian?
So I would say we don't have we're seeing now a growing need to provide education around financial wellness and financial literacy, and trying to bring forward those opportunities. I feel fortunate that we don't have a lot of call for assistance around that. The issues around housing issues around being able to find housing at all is not as large of a call on my team as we have the issues around how can I work closer to where I live. So that, on balance, that feels like a better place to be in the bad choices, but we are increasing our resources for employees.
And Jacqueline, maybe a little background about low-income housing, because that's your world. What is that, and how can people get more information about that as a part of their process?
Great, and I'll just say that, back to just reflecting, is Enterprise is actually looking at the career lattice of its team from the front desk all the way to the top to sort through how we increase wages for people to make sure that they're not housing insecure. So what is affordable housing? Affordable housing means that you're not rent burdened. I think probably many of these people in the room may not be rent burdened, but that means that you're only maybe paying a third of your income for rent.
Yeah, but I want to specifically get to low-income housing, the eligibility for that, make sure people understand how to get to that path.
Okay, so low-income housing and getting to that path, you have to be very low income in terms of 60% or AMI of to qualify affordable housing, and that's largely low-income housing tax credit projects. There are also other eligible programs such as Section 8 vouchers. I see Doug Guthrie here, people that are a position where they pay 30% of their income for rent and they get to live in a quality, decent, affordable housing unit.
Good, thank you. Let's move on and talk about the incentives for employers to do this look in the mirror, to mitigate the expenses and to address the cost issues. So we talked generally about that. Anybody have any thoughts about is there any proof of retention in some of the programs you're doing right now? I mean, obviously, Jillian, you're talking about your salaries are relatively higher, and so obviously that is some of a prevention to some of these issues, but I don't think we can all be secure in any of the things we're doing. So what incentives that you're using or see, or incentives that we might think could be provided?
I'll say I think that we're exploring the creative approach that we learned about thanks to LABC's work on workforce development last year. LAUSD had a very creative approach on creating, helping to create some housing by making available land that they owned and then having some call on that housing, that affordable housing for their lowest income workers. That approach we thought was a very creative one. It's actually a back to the future for us. Long, long ago, we've been in business 150 years, we actually had workforce housing at a number of our locations, and we had employees that lived in workforce housing. We moved away from that probably more than 30 years ago, but we're now exploring it again, looking at those properties that we have that are in areas where potentially they could be developed into housing, and how could we make some of that housing available for our own workforce as well as for others.
So we, at Cedars-Sinai, similar to what was just described, years past we had housing for employees. That had been something that we had been actively doing. Again, because of the cost of housing, it became not affordable for us to do any longer. I know that many of our employees have reached out to us and have asked, if there's a building that they see as they're driving into work, they say, hey, there's a building for sale. Can Cedars-Sinai buy that building and put us up there? I know that many of our academic sister organizations, so UCLA, USC, others, I know Stanford, talking to my colleague up there, they do a lot of that as well. Since we're not associated with a university, the challenge that we have is where we are physically located, there just is not a lot of room. Many of our employees have said, how about buying the Beverly Center and turning that into housing for us? I would love...
You always like the idea box at work,
That's right, that's right. So those are great ideas. I love them, but I think all of us in this room know that unfortunately isn't practical.
So let me ask you, as particularly the HR folks here, but I'd love to hear Jacqueline's comments too. How are you staying in touch with employee sentiments and needs and issues? Is there a formal way to do that? I mean, obviously there's people that make great suggestions like buying the Beverly Center, but in addition to that, what other methodologies are being used to really get your hands on the pulse, and what are you seeing regarding turnover right now, and what is your kind of metrics and benchmarks about that?
So the key ways that it's a challenge with a large and dispersed organization, but we have engagement surveys that we use, and those give us an idea just of sentiment and how comfortable and stressed people are feeling about.
Are those annual, or how often?
They're biannual,
Okay.
and then we do updates. But one of the things that we've initiated as a result of that is also we've created sort of an internal panel of employees to share, have ongoing conversations about employee concerns and employee interests. And so that's another vehicle for employees to raise, these are the kinds of issues that are on our minds. These are the kinds of things that are concerning us, rather than us asking the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so very similar, and probably like many of you in this room, your own organization. So we do an annual employee engagement survey. We do pulse surveys where we take the pulse of the organization throughout the year. We have employee focus groups and forums, that type of thing, to understand what's on their minds. Interestingly, the housing issue, I would think I would hear more of. So I know it's an issue for a small population of our folks. It's not an issue that is broad across the organization. But certainly it does contribute to the retention and recruitment of folks. And I think about this as I get personally very involved in recruiting some of our senior folks that we're trying to recruit from Houston, as an example. So if you have a physician in Houston that you need their specialty because there's a need here in the city, and as they're in Houston, they have a 6,000 square foot house and horses and a large area of land. And when we when I sit with them at lunch and try to talk to them about life in Los Angeles, you know, certainly there's not a comparison, and we try to be very clear and direct about what it looks like. You know, hopefully we bring them on a day when the weather's great, so that we can sell some of the benefits of Los Angeles.
But that property in Houston might fit well into the Beverly Center.
It could. It very well
could,
very
yeah.
well could, right. So that's how we look
So,
at it.
so Jacqueline, let me go to you about, you've been doing this work for a long time. Your organization's been one of the leaders of trying to bring together sort of the cross-sector partnerships to make things happen. When you look at public-private partnerships, a lot of talk about more cross-sector stuff, you know, the balance between the public and the private. What do you see as working right now, and where do you see us going in terms of in the engagement of the sectors and working together more?
What I think is working well is actually the county and city are working together to address housing issues, and I think that that is unprecedented, and I'm excited about that. But I think what's working is more models like Taylor Yards, you know, where we use underutilized publicly owned land, and we use that to build housing with developers. I think the developer on that particular project is McCormick Baron Salazar. And looking at the public agency, which was Metro, looking at the developer, and looking at that site to do a mixed income, mixed use strategy to meet those community needs, I think more work like that needs to be replicated. Gary did a couple of studies where it showed where a car dealer got involved with housing in the community and looking at finding housing for the people that actually live well nearby. I think those are the type of models that can be replicated, because when we think about building housing and the housing shortage, one of the biggest costs is acquisition. So what's out there that we're using at other places, such as maybe not the Beverly Center, but you know, the Cedars-Sinai campus, is there somewhere where people are parking where you can figure out where you can go vertical and start to have housing and parking and other things? I think that we've been a one-note city, let's just build housing, or let's just build an office space, but not think more broadly about a live-work-play strategy. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. In terms of transportation, because we know all these things are related, and we've talked about it, about understanding the commute times, and the report delves into this rather deeply. What are you doing right now as employers as relates to, you know, subsidizing, assisting with transportation right now? There's one thing that you start to look at the map. If you do your maps and say, wow, our folks are, you know, they're spending a lot of time, and that has stress related to it as well as productivity. Andy, what about at Cedars-Sinai?
Yeah, so we do the traditional things, you know, subsidize, you know, metro passes and carpooling, and we do van pools and those kinds of things. But, you know, the fact of the matter, and I appreciate the good work that was done in the analysis for a healthcare organization, workplace flexible hours isn't something that's very practical. Mm-hmm. So you know, when you think about the nurses and the physicians, mm-hmm. and who have to be on site to work with patients when they are there, when they are sick, you can't say, gee, you're going to do a 980. You know, it's just not practical for the work that we do. You know, I've worked in other organizations where that is a viable tool to use. So we're at a bit of a quandary, and as I said earlier in my comments, the commute times, and I know everyone in this room feels this too, the commute times contribute to the overall stress and burnout of people on the job. And again, from my perspective, I want physicians and nurses who are going to be engaged and ready to work and ready to help you when you're sick. And so that's why this problem continues to be unique. You know, for us specifically at Cedars-Sinai, part of the challenge is we're nowhere near a freeway. You know, so you know, UCLA, you've got the 405. You know, at Keck, you're near the 110 and the 10 freeways. You know, you have to get off the freeway and drive another 30 minutes before you can get to Cedars-Sinai. So it is definitely a challenge, and unfortunately, we can't move the campus. Yeah, we're there.
Well, you've been talking about moving the campus, but anyway, SoCalGas.
So we have a mix, and I think I want to also talk to the policy. But I guess as a story, we have parts of our work that are not flexible, and for those we'll see before the morning meeting at the operating base, it's deserted, and you ask, where is everybody? Well, they're sleeping in their trucks because they drove in at 4 in the morning, and they're sleeping till the start of their shift. So we don't have that quite figured out, but I think that the cost and availability of transportation, the feasibility of transportation, really has to be part of the frame. And for the region that we serve, later today there's going to be a discussion around electrification of transportation. I think that it's very important that we look at what additional burden that's going to place and what other solutions and resources can be on the table. So to speak to the earlier points, I think it's very important that we not have single note solutions to all of these policies, that these are complex problems that are going to require a range of solutions. So we want to keep solutions like natural gas trucking on the table. We want to keep solutions, we want to keep the opportunities to use all of our energy resources on the table. And we want to be very conscious of all of the factors that are pushing those commutes. So housing is a really important cost, but the second largest housing cost for most households is utilities. So we have to look at that as well. And what are the policies that are driving up the cost of utilities? Because you bring down the cost of housing and you can offset it with an increase in the cost of utilities, and you're right back where you started. So policies to convert all of our energy use to electricity will cost the average household $900 a year, will increase the cost of new construction by $1,400. Can we afford that? Is that the right policy direction? So as we look at it, we're trying to look at the broad dimensions of all of the parameters and make sure that we keep as many solutions on the table as we can. And that's where we're looking at a master planning solution across all of our operations to figure out where we can move operations, how can we cluster them? How do they align with where our employees are and where do we think our employees will be? And move those operations that we can into areas that are closer to where the employees can live.
And one of the things that, again, not the subject here, but the massive infusion of transportation construction by Metro and the opportunities going forward pre-Olympics and post-Olympics. Yeah, we've done analysis with many of the partners in this room about what is happening 5 blocks on either side of those rail projects as it relates to access, development, lifestyle, well-being, and equity. And that really shows you what the opportunities can be, because obviously proximity to transportation is going to be a big deal. Well, we're coming to the close of this session, and really what I'd like to do is just go around quickly, get some, maybe a takeaway for you that's something that's different that you learned from the conversation that we've had today and thinking about the report. And 2, some advice for the next speaker, our mayor for the city of Los Angeles. What would we ask him to think about? So maybe Jackie, we'll start with you.
Well, for me, I think it's important of partnership. So we're just talking about employers today, but we were just talking about Metro recognizing that it's investing in infrastructure, but it also needs to invest in housing because that infrastructure is really changing some of those neighborhoods. And so we even work with California Community Foundation, Low Income Investment Fund, to even work with Metro to think about dedicating its sites where 35% of those units, affordable housing units that will be built there will be affordable, and also leveraging their capital to invest in affordable housing through what we're calling the Metro Affordable Transportation Community Housing Fund, where we're doing more aggressive lending and hoping to double density around major transit corridors. What I would say to the mayor and other people is that there's a lot of publicly owned land. I think the housing department is doing a great job of moving some of those old CRA assets, but what other public land does the city own, whether it be a parking lot and other underutilized space, and how do we use that to create and meet community needs, and housing being one of the biggest areas we need to focus on. But other people desperately want to see better schools. They want to see employment opportunities in their neighborhoods, because we're talking about people commuting, because people are commuting to like employment corridors. So can we create more employment places where people can work, live in the same place? So I would say look at what we have that's underutilized, and looking with employers to look at their underutilized assets to figure out how we can build more.
Thank you. Andy.
We need more. So first of all, I'm glad that we're having the dialogue. We need more of this discussion to happen. We need more incentives and credits for organizations who employ 15,000 people. We need to have more of that so that it will be helpful for us to make some positive changes there. But it is, and everyone in this room knows this, it's a challenge, and we need to have a multi-prong approach, and we have to make the city livable. We need to really focus on making the city livable. As I mentioned, as we think about bringing candidates in from other states to do cancer research at Cedars-Sinai, and they're driving the neighborhoods, they worry that they see lots of homeless encampments and folks. So we've got to find a way to better utilize the land that we have and hopefully put that to work.
Thank you. Gillian.
I think the key takeaway is really coming out of what Dr. Painter was talking about, which is I think that as employers, and particularly for those of us that our whole business is here, we just need to directly engage on each of these issues. We need to directly engage on the development of housing, on particular developments. We need to directly engage on the cost and barriers to housing being developed, and to have more direct involvement in what resources can be made available for our employees and for our customers, and really directly engaging in supporting the homeless initiative, supporting the development of housing, and supporting the keeping solutions on the table and removing barriers to additional developments.
Yeah. So as you've listened patiently and through this process here, some of you may say, well, there's nothing really new here. It's really about doing some very basic things. We're adding the notion, though, of the vulnerability of our own employees, the vulnerability of our community. How that's interconnected to one another is really one of the things that emerges out of the conversation and the Gary Painter report. So I hope this has helped you start to think about the inside-outside. Like, what are you going to do when you get back to your shops and start to think about it? And how do we connect externally to other resources and opportunities to be advocates for a community that can start to address this more holistically? Help me thank the panel: Jacqueline Waggoner, Andy Ortiz, and Gillian Wright. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, here to introduce this morning's keynote address, Kari Dohn, Managing Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at JPMorgan Chase.
Wow, what an outstanding panel. Let's give them another round of applause. As we heard from the last panel, for us to achieve our goal of providing every Angelino affordable housing, we in the private sector must play our role and do our part in addressing our region's housing needs. We are committed at JPMorgan Chase to doing our part, and I'd like to share in the last decade, we have financed over $450 million in affordable housing and community development projects just here in LA alone. And as we heard from Dr. Painter, we're also trying to use our philanthropy. And from our JPMorgan Chase Foundation, we have funded over millions of projects and local nonprofits, stretching from Enterprise Community Partners to Little Tokyo Service Center, and most recently, Genesis LA, which was a winner of our National Pro Neighborhoods competition. As we all know, cities like LA are at the heart of this work. They are at the heart of the innovation that we're seeing around the US and around the globe in affordable housing and community development. And I'd like to share that I'm very excited that our newest initiative is our largest philanthropic initiative to date. We launched 2 weeks ago called Advancing Cities. And this is a $500 million, 5-year initiative. It's global. And what we hope to do with that is really lift up the most innovative practices in affordable housing and community development, economic opportunity, and inclusive growth. So, there is no greater champion for inclusive growth and affordable housing and equitable community development than Mayor Eric Garcetti. It is my great, great pleasure to introduce Mayor Garcetti today. He's a 4th-generation Angelino, the 42nd mayor of Los Angeles, and in 2017 won the mayoral contest by the widest margin ever in LA. Among his many accomplishments, Mayor Garcetti has led LA to raise its minimum wage, lower its business tax, set ambitious housing goals, and pass the nation's boldest transportation plan. He also played a major role in winning the Olympics and bringing a very bold vision for LA, his 28 by 28 plan. Most recently, the mayor pushed a Bridge Home initiative, which, as you know, is an emergency declaration to create shelters in every community where homeless individuals may have a refuge and services provided that they so desperately need. We in the private sector, JPMorgan Chase and my fellow colleagues in the private sector, look forward to supporting his efforts to house the homeless, reduce barriers to constructing affordable housing, and increasing transit accessibility. And we so thank the mayor for his leadership. So without further ado, let us welcome Mayor Eric Garcetti.
I heard applause. I was outside. I said, was that me? They're like, yeah, get in there. So, good morning, everybody. What a beautiful vision of this city. What an important place for all of us to be and for all of us to mark time. There's 2 ways I mark time in my life these days. The growth of our daughter, Maya, who's now 6 and, as she reminds me, 3/4 years old, and the LABC Annual Housing Summit, which I have come to now for 17 years. I was thinking on the way here, it is the one event since I've been an elected official I have never missed and come to every single year that I've been an elected official. And it's almost like rings of a tree. You can see the passage of time. You can see the growth of the vision of the city. You can see the work that we all have done across so many sectors, and the expansion of this prism of housing into something much bigger than just housing, but jobs and transportation, and the mix of those 3 in order to build a great city that one day we will all look back on and say we had a small role in moving forward. It's such a joy to come to this every single year because the years tell us things that the days cannot see. Our life, probably all of us, feels like a giant run-on sentence sometimes. We have rare moments of punctuation, to just pause with a comma, or to stop with a period, to celebrate with an exclamation point, to ask questions with a question mark. And I always find that this summit is that moment to kind of punctuate life and to think about the next chapter. And it's always been such a joy to work with the Los Angeles Business Council a business organization that always wants to figure out what is the route to get to yes. In a time when government and business groups and labor, environmental groups, and so many people play defense all the time, and we have to figure out how to get to no, to have a relationship with an organization that really is about how we get to yes on the most pressing issues, and the interconnectedness of them has always been, for me, quite an honor. How do we build a city with a thriving middle class? How can we build housing that hardworking families can afford? How do we take on traffic that steals dollars and hours from our precious lives? And the report that you published just this week recognizes the intersection of all of these questions, and I commend you on it. Pushing us to think bigger, harnessing the power of the private sector to directly support workers, to reduce NIMBYism, and to get involved in housing-related programs. And I know when things get tough, we can count on the LABC to get creative and to pull together a coalition. You were with me when we said that we needed to adjust wages in this town to keep up with the poverty that we have and to try to address it. And today we have a raising of a minimum wage that adds about $3.4 million every working hour to 640,000 people who support 640,000 families. A tough thing to do because not everybody's a winner. There's a few losers in that, but on balance, the biggest anti-poverty program that the city has ever seen. We came together for a feed-in tariff, imagining a day when we would harness this beautiful sunlight that attracted us or our ancestors to come here and actually use it to power our city. And today, with the feed-in tariff, among other things that we passed together with LABC, we are the #1 solar city in America. You were with me together on Measure M when we imagined not just something incremental, but building on the success of Measure R and the hopes of Measure J that didn't get passed. What would be the biggest transportation measure we could ever imagine? And could we make it an evergreen measure, one that never sunsetted? And indeed, we got a 71% vote to be able to build 15 new rapid transit lines in a single American city, the most ever done at one moment in history, not just in LA, but in the United States of America. You are exactly what a business organization should be, not just interested in companies' individual bottom lines, but all of our community's long-term strengths. And we've seen the results. It has been a dizzying 5 years here in Los Angeles. We've slashed unemployment by more than half, grown jobs more quickly than California, who's grown jobs more quickly than America. We've added more than 236,000 new businesses. Think about that for a moment. That's the size of a mid-sized American city, and that's the number of new businesses in this town in just 5 years. We've paved more roads than any time in history, 8,800 miles worth, got back to the basics of fixing sidewalks. We're ranked #1 by Bloomberg that did a report on all the major cities in America and how well they are run using metrics and the management that we have, and we were the only one selected as a gold city in the United States of America. And our economy now is the 3rd largest municipal economy in the world, after Tokyo and just behind New York City, even though we're 22nd in population, which makes us the most productive city on the face of the earth in terms of our economic output per capita. Simply put, Los Angeles is thriving. I see David Chu over there, our great assembly member and dear friend, and I was just up in San Francisco yesterday. I got a call from Vice President Biden, who was in town. He said, I need to get permission to be in Los Angeles. I said, I'm not in Los Angeles. You can be the acting mayor. I'm up in San Francisco. And I tried to recruit a few Dodger fans up there with not much success, because I told them, you know, when the Clippers and Lakers lose, I do root for the Warriors out of California loyalty. But you see in San Francisco the creativity and the booming that's going on there. You see this Golden State. But we also know that we look out there, and as exciting as this momentum is, how many cities are jealous of what we have with the cultural institutions and the sporting events and the things that are coming here. We also know that the speed of things has also brought some new challenges with us, and that remind us that our work is not done. Because for too many members of the middle class, those basic pillars of the California dream seem out of reach. There's not a single middle-class family that doesn't wonder if the children that they will be able to stay in the city where they're grown. My daughter and I recently went to Camp Hollywoodland in Griffith Park. I don't know if anybody ever went there or has gone there, but there you go, got some alums. And there's a daddy-daughter sleepover weekend twice a year. And I was talking to a fellow father who works in the entertainment industry as a grip. And he said, you know, I grew up in the Valley. I said, I grew up in the Valley. He said, my grandfather bought his house for $5,000. And my father, he bought his house for $50,000. And I bought my home for $500,000. But I look at my daughter and I worry that if she has to buy a house for $5 million, our story in LA is going to end. The fragility of our middle class is the biggest threat that our city, and indeed our country, faces today. The middle class has always been, in my mind, about three things: where you live, the job you have, and how you get between the two. In some ways, that's what the theme of this conference is: jobs, housing, and transportation. And in a moment when things in America are changing more quickly than ever before, we need to be thinking aggressively about big and bold ways to rebuild that middle class, to look at a future full of housing, jobs, and good transportation. That's why we're here. Because if Los Angeles is going to remain a city of opportunity tomorrow, we need to act today. And as a nation, it's time to start acting for the long game once again. I've always tried to govern by not thinking about the headlines of today, but I imagine myself after I'm mayor and I'm retired and maybe even a grandparent living in this city, looking back and not wanting to have any regrets on what we did back then. Because if you follow the headlines in any given moment, you get obsessed by the fights of the moment, policies that might seem unpopular on that day or that year, instead of really planning, which Los Angeles hasn't always done, for the decades-long or even century-long perspective. I believe that's why we're all called to serve. It's what it means to lead. That's why we're fighting in Los Angeles to build a thriving middle class, to carve out a clear path for anybody who wants to reach that, a place where families can pull themselves out of poverty, where kids can reach out to grasp each rung on that ladder of opportunity, and where workers can count on a secure retirement, even if they're not rich. We've already come a long, long way. Some days, for some, it may not feel like it, but I just want to reflect back on the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I came before you and set the most ambitious goal in 3 decades, to help enable 100,000 units of housing to be built just in the city of LA in order to meet demand, bring costs down. We also looked at supporting key industries so that we weren't just raising a minimum wage to $15, but looking at those $50 an hour jobs, aerospace, the film industry, things that we had ignored, cutting the city's business tax to help small businesses get started up even as we raised the minimum wage. We embarked on the nation's largest public works project by building out our transportation infrastructure, not just through Measure M, but $15 billion at our airport and $3 billion at America's port, the largest in North and South America combined. We said we'd be ambitious and go after the Olympics and the Paralympics. And now we've done all of those things, not just one of them, all of them. I found a card I wrote myself in the first month I was mayor of 5 stretch things that I was hoping we could get a couple of them: to pass a big homeless measure, a big transportation measure, redo the airport and bring transit there, pass the LA River Plan and go after the Olympics. And my little note underneath it said 2 out of 5 good, 3 out of 5 great, the rest gravy. And we've collectively done 5 out of 5 of those things, which isn't to say that homelessness disappears overnight or traffic is gone. But we wanted to lay down the marker to know that a decade from now, people wouldn't look back and say, why didn't they do something about those things? And on our housing goal, we've issued permits for more than 80,000 units of housing. And that 8-year goal, we're going to get to 100,000 units 2 years early, in just 6 of those 8 years, thanks to this room and many others around the city who have built housing and believed in housing, and communities who have said yes instead of no, and the mechanisms for financing our low-income housing and changing our zoning that have allowed us to liberate what we have, our land that we collectively own, to work for all of us. We're building more transportation infrastructure than any city in America. We brought back runaway entertainment filming with the film tax credit, thank you to our state legislature, bringing $6 billion and nearly 450,000 jobs to the Golden State that would have been elsewhere. And as I mentioned, we won our third Olympics and what will be our first Paralympics. But we've moved forward so quickly that if anything, the challenges that we face come from our velocity. There are some cities struggling to get people where they are. Land is really cheap. You can get houses for $20,000 or $30,000. Our problem is the opposite. So many people want to be here. So many jobs have roared back that in a prosperous economy, too many people have been left behind. We want to make sure that everybody in every community can share in the wealth that this city creates. We've almost quadrupled the number of summer jobs for youth When I came in, only 5,000 young people could find jobs, and now we've connected more than 17,000 on our way to 20,000 summer youth jobs. We've helped over 11,000 veterans get connected with good jobs as they've come home from war and taken off their military uniforms and put on suits. We're on pace to double the rate of our affordable housing construction as well. And in less than 2 years since HHH has passed, we've added more than 78 permanent supportive housing projects into the pipeline, representing more than 5,000 units to end homelessness in this city. We lobbied the state to recognize the urgency of our homelessness crisis, and thank you again to our state legislators who stepped up, Assemblymember Chu, State Senator Wiener, others who heard us. And we have $166 million from the state this year already for emergency grants to help build on what we are doing to end homelessness. And this month we opened the first of many bridge housing sites in downtown, the birthplace of our city, right next to Olvera Street where the city started. We've opened up 45 beds where there's 24/7 support and storage, and you can bring your partner and you can bring your pets and you can get the therapy that you need and you can get the counseling that is critical and the health care and the doctors. And those first 45 will be replaced by another 45 in a few months, and we will see, hopefully in other parts of this city, a dozen or dozens of these sprout up alongside the expanded shelter beds with our county, the permanent supportive housing that we're building, and more than 1,000 new people who are working as outreach workers and mental health professionals and housing navigators to make sure that we do look back and say this was the decade that we ended homelessness on the streets of LA. I could go on, but suffice it to say what we have accomplished together really is remarkable. I know some of us are pessimists and we're midway up the mountain and all we can see is the peak. But when people visit us from other cities, when I talk to mayors from other places, when they come down here to look at what we're doing, they say, we wish we were you. Not in terms of the numbers of tents or the amount of traffic, but in how you're boldly confronting what is before you. And we can see the progress even if you can't see it in front of you. And we did this together. This wasn't about credit for any level of government or for the private sector alone, the nonprofit sector, or even our academics who have helped us think through so many of these things. What other city in America can lay claim to all of those achievements? To me, LA has always been defined by three things. We've been defined by our freedom, kind of encapsulated in this wide open expanse of a city, the beauty of its land, but the freedom to do what you want. Its openness to creativity and innovation. We're always rethinking tomorrow. We're looking at a new way to get into space or to tunnel underground or to connect cars or to rethink storytelling. But above all, the third quality, beyond that freedom and that innovation, to me has always been a sense of belonging. I've never been a huge fan of words like tolerance and inclusion and diversity because it implies that somebody is giving others their tolerance and you can be included. Belonging is something we can all own, no matter whom we are. It says that this place is ours. This place where we first had native peoples who then folks came to, ancestors of those who came as immigrants or those who came in chains, people who decided to pick up wherever they were and to come out here and to find a place that accepted them and where they belonged. But the question is now, how do we take those three qualities and apply them to transportation, to jobs, and to housing? How can we use our strengths to adapt to an uncertain future? Years ago, I realized the only way to determine our own destiny in America's local communities was to seize that destiny by the horns. That I realized Washington can be, should be, we need it to be a key partner, and we hope for a day when it will be again. But America faces a $3 trillion infrastructure deficit. Our roads and our bridges, our highways, our ports, our airports and plants, once the envy of the world, are the worst in the industrialized world. Our transportation, communications, housing networks, electricity networks are the worst in the industrialized world. And the cavalry isn't coming anytime soon from our nation's capital. While they talk about $200 billion of infrastructure that they could pass any day, the same day we elected a new president, America's cities passed $230 billion worth of infrastructure, led by Measure M here. In other words, America isn't over there. It's right here in this room, in communities like this across our country. This has always been a country made powerful by where we live in our local communities, not granted that power from our nation's capital. This city is older than Washington, D.C. Our history and our particularity here is something that we know and that we embrace and that we build from. We know that our bridges could collapse in an earthquake, that our planet is warming. We have our firefighters in California who have died on the line in historic fires, each year bigger because of drought that is the new normal. And our housing shortage is untenable. And in our cities, we can't afford to ignore challenges. We can't invent problems like Washington and then not even solve them. We have to get our hands dirty and actually do that work. And it's high time for America to build our future, because that future is now. So we're responding to the threats of climate change with clean transportation, from electric vehicles and zero-emission trucks and buses to launching Blue LA, a car share program that provides electric vehicles not in the fanciest neighborhoods, but the poorest neighborhoods of LA first, for folks who both need transportation sometimes and want to be part of cleaning up the air because they probably live in a neighborhood where the air is worse. We're using LA as a test bed for autonomous vehicles, exploring Hyperloop, working with the Boring Company. We're going to build a gondola that soars to Dodger Stadium so we can celebrate the World Series victory this year. Well, we won't have the gondola done by this year, but you get my point. And we are saying this is a city that is open for business. Test it here. I was meeting yesterday with a California company that is working on VTOLs, vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. Imagine going from Glendale to Century City in 7 minutes for $40 with an electric aerial vehicle that would take you through traffic. And there's a lot of space up there. There's not much space down here. There's a lot of space up there. And they said, I hope that we can test it in Los Angeles first. And I said, I want you to. Because what a pity it would be for California to invent all these technologies and then see other countries, to say Dubai and China and other places, say, we're going to scale it up here first because our own red tape gets in our way. Just last month, we got the green light to finally finish the Purple Line and bring the subway to the west side of Los Angeles. And yes, thank you, Washington. It's the first thing Washington has done in the country of any public transportation in the last 2 years, and they did say yes to us. So we're not just preparing for the future of transportation, we're driving it. And I think that we won the middle class back here when we passed Measure M. It's 787,000 jobs. Let that sink in for a second. 787,000 jobs that you can't export. And they're not just jobs. I should correct myself. They're careers. Because a job is like, okay, you're going to work on this project for a few months or a couple years. This will be for the next 40 years and beyond, so that young people can go into the building trades and they can put together the trains that will move people in this city, and they can construct the tunnels that we need and be a part of being the engineers of that. And we're shaping the new economy of the city by investing in tomorrow's CEOs today. Just last week, we launched WeSTEM, a program that ensures young women are equitably included in our tech and our engineering sectors. And we started the Evolve Entertainment Fund during this Time's Up and Oscars So White moment when everybody is well-intentioned about diversifying our entertainment industry. We actually are making sure people get their fair shot at careers in Hollywood. We hosted one of the largest tech job fairs in this country, 2 years running, 14,000 people who lined up downtown, companies from SpaceX to the city of LA, and it looked like this room, and it looked like this city, and it looked like this world. It reflected the diversity of who we are. And we're in the process of hiring, as I mentioned, nearly 1,000 people to join us in the fight to end homelessness. We brought 4 counties together to fight for and win a designation for advanced manufacturing in aerospace. And earlier this week, I started, this is Manufacturing Week, if you didn't know, Happy Manufacturing Week, I'm sure it's on your calendar. And I visited Aerojet Rocketdyne, where in the city of Los Angeles, every single rocket with a flawless safety record and flawless 100% record lifted every single space shuttle mission. They had every space shuttle mission listed there. Into the heavens, and now is building a rocket that could take us to Mars. And by the way, they have 140 good-paying jobs available right now in the city in manufacturing and aerospace. You see, when we focus on these things, these policies work, and they put people back to work. Los Angeles, no doubt, is a great city. By the time the Olympics come here in 2028, just as 1932 announced that we were a global city, and 1984 said we were a great global city, 2028 will show the world that we are one of the most indispensable, top 5 great global cities of the world. But no one in a great global city should be forced to squeeze into a 1-bedroom apartment with 10 other people. No one. When a hardworking single mom comes home from a long day, waiting tables, counts up her tips, and knows that after she pays her rents, her 5-year-old son's birthday gift is out of reach, we know we have a problem. No matter what your politics are, we can all agree that that's not right. Today, the average one-bedroom rental apartment in this city costs nearly $2,400 a month. 430,000 low-income families, so that's not people, the families, are worried about keeping a roof over their head. More than 1 million people have that stress every single day. Now, I believe the city is doing everything in our power to reverse that trend, leveraging every resource, looking at our zoning, our subsidies, working with folks, innovating at every turn, cutting back on bureaucracy and red tape, but we cannot do it alone. I do call today on the federal government to do its fair share. I've come together with mayors around this country to say it's time for a national housing policy again, like we saw with a mixed government led by Republicans and Democrats in the 1980s. It means putting, like we saw in the 60s when there was a commitment, like we saw after the war in World War II, and there was a commitment to housing our veterans. We know how to do this. It's not brand new. But it means putting a lot more money into the programs we know work. It's time for Washington to start talking about housing like they talk about health care and food security, that housing is a basic human right. And if you work hard, if you're disabled, if you're a senior citizen checking the mailbox for your Social Security check, and you can't find an affordable place to live, government should be there for you, or should enable all of us to be there for you. So housing must become a key component of our nation's social safety net in a national conversation. But this year, our president unfortunately proposed an almost $9 billion cut to HUD. Luckily, he said that wasn't a real budget, it was just a vision statement, and that gave Congress the power to correct that in a bipartisan manner. So something tells me Washington isn't going to give us a hand anytime soon. But here in Los Angeles, I hope we can inspire Washington, because we get things done. We solve problems. We're cutting red tape. We're updating every one of our community plans. And just this year, we rezoned about 2,000 acres around the new Expo line, adding capacity for more than 6,000 new units of housing. We even rezoned a small single-family zone. When's the last time that happened in Los Angeles? We're making the hard decisions about how to grow, where to grow, and doing it in our communities from the ground up, the way planning should be done, expanding and innovating financial programs to produce more affordable housing. With a linkage fee, we can go even further. We've launched a new loan fund that is helping to rehabilitate older units in popular neighborhoods and transform them into affordable housing, and reopened our moderate income homeowner assistance program for the first time in more than a decade. And when we build, we're building with design in mind. I think the libertarian days of like, build whatever style you want are over. And we're not going to prescribe one style for Los Angeles, but even hiring Christopher Hawthorne as our city's first chief design officer, to invite him to come from being a brilliant critic at the LA Times to into the dark side and come over into City Hall, gives us all a chance to have those conversations and to look good and to make sure that we are thinking about 50 years from now, what will this look like on the streetscape? And LABC is committed to working with our housing department and Councilmember Koretz on a design competition that will award a private developer the right to develop supportive housing on a prime city-owned parking lot on the west side, just on Santa Monica Boulevard near the cancer death sign, the smoking death sign. Anybody else have friends who used to go there New Year's and watch it go to zero? Oh, it was kind of like, yay, nobody's dead. Then it went one. Anyway, sorry. If they use innovative technology and design to build things cheaper and faster, we can see a model. And I want to thank LABC and Councilmember Koretz for leading on that. Our transit-oriented communities, the biggest uncovered and unreported innovation in this city, is going gangbusters. It's been a runaway success in just 1 year. And for those of you who don't know, this is true big transit stops where you can go up, and you can go up and more dense if you add more affordable housing. And the deeper the affordability is, the higher you can go. I'm proud to report that we have filings for more than 8,600 units of new by-right housing. And the best thing about it, almost 20% of those units will be affordable to low-income Angelenos, and of those 20%, a third of them at extremely low income, where we never get units at all. That is the success of a city being smart and working together. And now we can take what we've learned and take that across the state and the country. Look at what the supportive housing ordinance that we passed last year is doing. I'm proud that Assemblymember Chu was inspired to pass a similar measure for everyone in the Golden State, and thank you, David, for that work. ADUs, we have 4,000 accessory dwelling units since January 2017. That's 7 times more than the last previous 4 years combined by opening that up. And of course, I'm excited that Senator Wiener is making so many trips down to LA studying our TOC program as he re-ups his efforts to allow for more housing near transit across the state. And we want to work with him and the legislature to find bold ideas that can build the housing we need. But we won't stop there. We can't. Today, I am directing the Department of City Planning to launch 2 new efforts that will make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing in LA. The first is a revision of our density bonus to make it a more streamlined process while respecting neighborhood character. It hasn't been a runaway success. Well-intentioned from the state, implemented through an ordinance, we just haven't gotten many units. So I want us to go back to the drawing board and see how we can, especially building on the success of the transit-oriented communities. The second is a long-awaited change to the city's site plan review process, one that Councilmember Cedillo has been leading on, sat down with LABC to help develop, and has been asking for. Make no mistake, site plan review is an essential process that ensures that new buildings fit seamlessly into the neighborhoods where they will be built. But too often it kills projects, causes unnecessary delays, and no land use policy can be a one-size-fits-all. So that's why I'm calling on city planning to develop a more nuanced policy that treats regional centers and transit corridors differently than lower-scale neighborhoods. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The sooner that we can cut red tape that is standing in the way, the sooner the state can help us on CEQA abuse reform, which has to be a priority for our new governor and for this next legislature, finally to say that. We just did it for our homeless housing, and thank you for that. Where now it goes straight through. We need to see that happen at the local level in all of our local governments as well from the state. Because the sooner we do that, the sooner we'll be cutting red tape and turning that into red ribbons at our new housing. But we also need to focus on protections for renters who live in our existing housing stock. That's why I've strengthened our rent stabilization ordinance and launched a Home for Renters campaign to spread the word about renters' protections to some of our most vulnerable communities in Los Angeles, from Watts to Westlake. And for the first time, you'll be able to find out if your apartment is protected by the RSO via text message. A lot of people just don't know or can't get online. And I'm proud to say that we'll be holding Know Your Rights workshops for renters in every council district over the next 6 months. So this November, I think there's some really important things we all can do. It just so happens that we're looking at an LABC election. Everything that we stand for is on the ballot. We have a chance to vote our values. So together we can do 3 things. We can vote to pass Props 1 and 2, critical funding to address homelessness and to build more affordable housing, and to defeat Prop 6, which might sound really nice to save a few cents at the gas pump, but trust me, you're going to be spending many more dollars at your mechanic. Or we might even lose lives as we see people on faulty roads, or if an earthquake comes when bridges collapse and overpasses. Prop 6 is helping us accelerate our future here in Los Angeles. Sorry, SB 1 is helping us accelerate it. Prop 6 would slow that down. And it helps bring critical statewide funding to bear here in LA and across the Golden State. So let's vote yes on 1 and 2. Let's defeat Prop 6 to save SB 1, because our streets, our public transit, these are worth it. They're worth it in our quality of life. In conclusion, I think our goals should be clear. And they shouldn't be policy goals. They shouldn't be financial goals. They shouldn't be statistical goals. They should be human goals. We must keep that focus on who we are. When we were trying to pass Measure M, we raised $10 million, thanks to many people in this room. And I'll share a little secret with you. When we ran 2 weeks of ads, we had enough money for a month of ads. We had always been about 63, 64%. We went down to 61% when we were running those ads of people paving the streets and the trains running. And we found, stock footage from the 1950s of no traffic, and we put that up there as if there'd be no traffic. And we went down to 61%. I was pretty sure, wow, for 3 years I've been working on this, building a coalition, staking all my political capital on the biggest, boldest thing that we've ever done in this city and in America, in this area. And Bill Carrick, a guy who I work with, who works with me on my campaign, said, I got an idea, Eric. Let's just get in the car, and I'll get a camera and ask you some questions from the back seat. No script, and let's just talk. So I got into my wife's Ford Fusion, and we started driving. It was a Saturday, and we hit traffic. And I turned to the camera, and I said, here we are in rush hour traffic. Only problem is it's Saturday afternoon. And everybody related to it. We related to that we budgeted that would take us a half hour, and now we're missing our kids' ball game. Or we decided, well, I'm going to be an hour late for that date. Maybe my dating pool needs to be a little bit smaller in, closer in. Or no, I'd love to go see the Philharmonic, but it's just too much of a pain to get there. I'd like to get to a Dodger game, but nah. And I think what we have to talk about is the human element of what we're doing. We are not building credit. We are not building dollars. We're not building even units. We are building a quality of life, and we are rebuilding a California and an American dream. What's at stake here isn't insignificant. What's at stake here is that American dream. Here in Los Angeles, I'm so proud to be part of a politics that is about addition and multiplication, not about subtraction and division. That we can, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, people of every racial and cultural background, people from different zip codes and different sectors, can find a way to get to yes at a moment in our country when everybody wants to point out why you should point your fingers at somebody and blame them. There's a great poem by Robert Browning that I've been reading recently, and one line from it says, a man's reach must always exceed his grasp. Man or woman, let's add. But a man's reach must always exceed his grasp. In other words, we do things that sometimes we know we won't be able to grasp ourselves, but we reach for them anyway. There were those who fought to end slavery even though they died still enslaved in this country. There were women who fought for women to have the right to vote even though they never got that, and it's been less than 100 years that women have been able to vote in America in national elections. Folks who fought to desegregate our schools, and people who fought to make sure that we could marry whomever we loved. And every so often, when we do allow our reach to exceed our grasp, we may be able to even hold that moment, or to make sure that we do it for the future. Although after measures H and HHH pass, people say, well, why is homelessness still here? And can we really end it? Of course. Our reach must always exceed our grasp. And the second line is, after all, what is heaven for? And I would say, let our reach exceed our grasp. After all, what is Los Angeles and America for? Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage our framer for our second panel, Jonathan Woetzel, Director of the McKinsey Global Institute.
Mayor's a hard act to follow. So I think we can get behind that, right? I mean, what else is what are we here for but to create those dreams? I'm here to just provide a few facts from our research over the last couple of years around the housing gap that we've had in California as a state, as a lead-in to the panel. So I'm just going to go through this relatively quickly. I won't use all of the slides, I promise. And hopefully it can lead to an informed, and I'm sure it will lead to a very robust debate. I also want to start off again by thanking Mary Leslie and the team at Los Angeles Business Council for organizing this convening. It's a great opportunity to have the conversation. So, all right, it's in the title there. 3.5 million homes by 2025. This number has gotten a lot of attention. I somehow regret that. I think that it's taking our eye off a little bit of the ball, which is it's a two-pronged problem. There's a supply and demand issue, clearly, but there's also a price issue. And these are two different things. But let's start off with the supply and demand issue. As we kind of know, California still is, as a state, holding up the bottom there with number 49 out of 50 in terms of housing per capita. Now, some of that is clearly demographics driven, sort of in household sizes, and some of that is also clearly demand driven, that there are lots of people who want to live here. But some of that is also supply driven, that we've simply not added a lot of housing. particularly over the last decade or so. That's been slower than most places on a per capita basis. So we can say we think it's natural forces, it's market forces. But we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And it wasn't always like this. We did add hundreds of thousands, as in the multiple hundreds of thousands of units, not so long ago, certainly within the lifetimes of everybody in this room. So why? Well, anyway, this is what you get. If you just, the 3.5 or the 2.5, if you take out existing forecasts, that's just math. So this is not a target, this is just math. If you want to achieve the average of other states, that's what it's going to look like. Now that's the supply and demand number. But let's, again, sort of recognize this is not only about supply and demand. A lot of this is about price. And we've clearly seen more money chasing less real estate over the last decade. With the result, also I should add that with income, of course, not catching up, that nowadays we talk about a housing crisis because it affects us. 80 to 120% area median income segments, over half of that cohort is rent burdened or housing burdened, pays more than 30% of its income across the state. So now it's a crisis. We should note that it's always been a crisis for the people with less than 80% AMI, but clearly now it's a crisis. And that reflects, I think, a couple of other factors. One is a greater move to greater investor ownership. We've seen an increase in rentals. We've seen a reduction, also importantly, in owner-occupied moves. These are national trends, not only California. So you have to be aware we're operating in a context, again, where just more money is chasing less real estate, resulting in more costs for all of us. It also results in economic impacts. $50 billion of unaffordable housing spend, the money that could have been going to pay for, I don't know, schools, movies, culture, you have it, and a total of $140 billion of lost economic output, which is represented by the difference between what we're building and what we need to build, and what we're paying for and what we need to pay for. So, with all of that, our research a couple of years ago asked the question, so is there enough land? Have we just run out of it? And it's clear that California, of course, does have a beautiful and very expensive coastline. But that doesn't mean we have run out of land. So we found more than enough land. Over half that land is transport related. And I think that caught everybody's eye. I want to say one thing though, most of that transport is not about your mega regional center. It's mid-rise. It's 6.5 to 15 units per net acre. That's the density we're talking about. Of that transit, about 30% of it's in the Los Angeles area, about 34% of it's in the Bay Area, another 8% in Sacramento, and the rest across the state. So that transit component is a critical component, but of course it's not the only component, and we have a number of other solutions that we're debating. From ADUs to infill development, to redevelopment, to continued growth of single-family homes. So, yes, I just mentioned the transport, so there we are. And a picture tells a bit of the whole story. So we're not building Manhattan here. Think Williamsburg, Brookline. So what will it take to unlock this supply? We argued three basic things: change the rules, cut the costs, unlock the finance. And I'm happy to hear some support for that agenda. Thank you. Change the rules. Let's make it easier to build. We have so many things that get in our way, but also so many incentives that get in our way. And we know this. We call it the fiscalization of land use. So simply put, it's not in our interest in some cases, to build. The costs are high. Construction industry, sad to say, is globally true, has not been the leader in reducing or improving its productivity, I should say. And there's an opportunity. And here, as the Golden State, there's so many technological resources, so much capacity to innovate and renovate. We need to think about that. We need to execute on that. And let's cut the cost. And finally, we need to unlock the finance. And we have some very positive opportunities here, including the opportunity zones, financing measures, as well as philanthropy. So what's happened? Over the last year, California added 309,000 people. It added 85,000 units. You can see the difference. And this, of course, means it's going to take a little bit more work. I should note that with the net of 309,000 units that California added, most of that net addition comes from international immigration and from domestic births. Net out-migration is still happening. Every year, 100,000 more people leave California from the other 49 states than come to California. Los Angeles added 33,000 people, added 14,000 units, which was the single largest addition in the state. So that's terrific. 12,000 of those units were multifamily. So we see very positive indicators here. At the state level, clearly had a lot of propositions passed. We had one or two go up and come down. I think we're going to debate this today. And here, of course, we had Triple-J passed with a 64% mandate, leading to, as the mayor said, very highly successful TOC incentive program. Los Angeles is not the only place that is doing that. San Diego is actually number 2 in terms of housing additions, 6,000 units added in 2017. That's about half of what Los Angeles added, with about 40% of the population or 30% of the population of the city. It's bigger than San Francisco. And they did that by pretty much going after parking, after floor area ratios, community engagement, investing in shared parking infrastructure, fairly exciting and direct approach. We've seen a lot of opportunities in other parts of the state, particularly where land costs are not so high, where ultimately the focus is on building. We can see reductions in up to 30% of costs through use of modular technologies, through rethinking our zoning and our fees to encourage density, and through accessing an opportunity zone financing. And finally, one other example just here, I feel compelled to give a shout out to Flyaway Homes as an example of a modular builder. 4 months to plan and design, 6 months to construct, $650 per month for a 1-bedroom apartment and permanent supportive housing. Pretty good. That building opened, I think about 2 weeks ago. So innovation is happening in housing in Los Angeles as well. Privately funded, I should note. So with that, I look forward to a robust debate, just a few facts for the panel's conversation. And I want to turn it over to the moderator of this outstanding panel.
Thank you, Jonathan. We always appreciate Jonathan's insight. His leadership at McKinsey has really provided a lot of guidance, a lot of policy thought for all of our candidates that are not only running for races throughout the state, but also for our Assembly and Senate leaders. And today we're very pleased to have an outstanding panel that's going to dive into some of these issues. Representing the state Senate here, we have Senator Wiener, who is one of the leaders in thought-provoking, introducing a lot of thought-provoking ideas relative to housing. Assemblyman Chu, who is also one of our leaders on policy and housing in the state of California, and obviously from the private sector, Clyde Holland, who you've heard speak at this conference multiple times. Clyde is also one of those leaders that is out there trying to break the mold and have us think outside the box as to how we're going to approach policy and land use in the state of California, and in particular locally in Los Angeles. And then pleased to have Robin Hughes, who is one of the top nonprofit affordable housing developers built around a mission of making sure that we serve those in need and making sure that we have social equity throughout our affordable housing developments in the state of California, in particular here in Los Angeles, where she is, again, one of our thought leaders. With that, I want to throw it out to really the senator first to talk about You know, SB 35, which was one of the leading legislations that really reached out and held local cities accountable for increasing their affordable housing production as well as overall housing, and then also set the benchmarks and your follow-up legislation that said, hey, we need to measure and identify how you're meeting those goals, and if not, what are the actions that we can take to ensure that you comply? And wanted to share your thoughts on where you saw the success across the state, in particular where that legislation had impact here locally in Los Angeles.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's good to be here with my own assembly member, David Chu, and I'm his senator, so we like to tag team around. So LA and the Bay Area have to work together, and we're seeing that more and more, which is great. So just framing it a little bit generally, the multi-million home deficit number is really daunting. We used to do it the old-fashioned way in California, to say as your population grows, you add new housing so that people have places to live. It's pretty common sense, but somehow things went a little haywire, probably starting in the 60s and 70s. And in California, we adopted what I like to call a de facto housing last policy, a de facto policy that it's not really important to have enough housing for everyone who needs housing. And so we did things like classify housing as a negative environmental impact. We did things like ban apartment buildings in huge swaths of California and a huge swath of LA, in 70% of San Francisco, to say it's illegal to build anything other than a single family home or maybe a 2-unit building, which is a way of basically saying poor people are not welcome in our neighborhood. Working class people are not welcome, only people who can afford very expensive single-family homes. So we are working very hard to try to right this ship, to say that yes, the look and the feel of our neighborhoods is important, views and parking and traffic are important, but you know what? It's more important not to have thousands and thousands of children in our public school or who are homeless. It's more important for working families to be able to stay in LA or the Bay Area near where they work. Sure. It's more important to have apartment buildings near public transportation instead of banning apartment buildings near public transportation, because all we do is increase carbon emissions by forcing people into 2-hour commutes. Those things are more important, and housing should not be at the bottom of the barrel. Housing is important. It's foundational to everything else. So last year, we took, I think, a first step with our housing package, including Senate Bill 35. And SB 35, what it did was pretty straightforward, that for communities that are not meeting their housing goals under the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, we are going to help you meet your housing goals by streamlining housing approvals in your community. That means that no CEQA, none, no discretionary review, no appeals, no planning commission approval, no conditional use. If you are a streamlined community because you are not meeting your housing goals, that housing permit, if someone proposes a building within zoning, it's a ministerial permit. Give me the permit. You can do 3 to 6 months of design review based on objective design standards, not like 5 years of, well, this person wants this design element, this person wants that. Objective design standards. So that's what the bill is. And by the way, this year we passed Senate Bill 828, which I also authored, to reform how we calculate housing goals. It will, for many communities, increase housing goals because our housing goals have not actually matched up with what we need. And so I think more communities will become streamlined. Since the bill went into effect earlier this year, we've seen some real success. The largest is in the city of Cupertino in the South Bay of the Bay Area, where Apple has its headquarters, a city with a history of allowing tons of jobs, like Apple, but very little new housing. There is a dead shopping center called Valco in Cupertino that people have been trying to develop into housing for years and years. The community has stopped it. Well, guess what? SB 35 meant that the developer walked up and said, give me my permit, and they have their permit. 2,400 units of housing, half of which will be affordable for people making up to 80% of area median income. In Berkeley, there is a very controversial project that is for hundreds of units of housing, half of which will be affordable to up to 80% of AMI. That is in litigation now, but that's moving forward. In San Francisco, we have now 2 different 100% affordable housing projects being streamlined under SB 35, which will cut up to a year worth of processing getting them approved. In LA, we are aware of 2 projects now that are 2 affordable housing projects that are considering it. They haven't filed yet, but they are actively considering SB 35 streamlining. And then we hear about smaller projects around the state, duplexes in the North Bay of the Bay Area, an 8-unit project in Daly City in my senatorial district. So it's not just about the big ones, it's about small projects that have gotten stuck and that are now getting quickly permitted.
Assemblyman Chu, just following on that concept before we come back and talk about 827, you've championed in Northern California increasing density around BARTs and transit centers and been successful in implementing legislation that's helped do that. How do you see the future of how we wrap 827, which died in the last legislative session at the Senate? How do you see that working moving forward to help us really push forward to increase the density around transits?
First of all, let me just thank you for inviting 2 San Franciscans to this event. Scott and I figured it was safe given the baseball season. But speaking of comparisons, we're here talking today because both in LA and in the Bay Area, the housing challenges and the transportation challenges have reached fever pitch. Unfortunately for the Bay Area, we actually hit the crisis before LA did. And this is in part why Scott and I have spent so much time working on this. But even when it comes to congestion, we are unfortunately literally right behind LA when it comes to congestion on our freeways. And so Scott and I have known each other for many, many years, but we didn't realize we were both working on TOD proposals. Scott put out an incredibly bold and large idea. I suggested something that was much more regional, but as I explain it, you'll see why it's an example of just how hard these conversations are. So for those of you who are familiar with our BART system, which is our Bay Area Rapid Transit System, it's been around for 45 years. BART owns 300 acres of land around 26 stations that they have been unable to develop since its inception in 1972. And the 300 acres are represented by 95% of them being surface parking lots. So literally we're just talking about cars as far as the eye can see. And what I proposed was that we rezone a bit more densely on top of surface parking lots. And I even said to cities, you can have parking underneath, just put housing and mixed use on top of it. That was the bill. And it ended up being one of the most intense housing fights that we had this year, the only TOD bill we were able to get through. And this was a regional bill to allow a transit agency to build and develop its own land. And we even agreed that 30% of the portfolio would be affordable, that we would only dictate as far as zoning density and height, but the rest of what projects look like would be dictated by locals. Despite that, I barely got out of the assembly with the support of my good friend Scott and others. We were able to get it to the governor's desk, and it was just signed this past week.
Congratulations.
But all this being said, it heralds the challenges of this fight. And we know, given global warming, given our housing and traffic congestion crises, we have to do more. And I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have this coming year with what Scott is going to be proposing. But we've got to all dig in, lean in, to make sure that we win these legislative battles and give communities around the state the ability to do real transit-oriented development.
And in that bill, how did you address CEQA or CEQA challenges?
It was difficult. Initially, the bill proposed that we essentially streamline all of the rezoning and the density and the height that we were asking for. And the Senate colleagues that had issues with Senator Wiener's bill asked me for amendments to drop that. And essentially what we're able to streamline in the project is one floor above what a particular city permits. for its zoning. So if a city, a suburban city in particular, says 3 stories or 4 stories is the highest height in the city, we get to streamline, say, 4 or 5. It certainly was not what we had been hoping for, but that was what we were able to get. Again, an indication of how hard this is.
So, and Senator Wiener, 827 died in the Senate this year, and again, thank you very much for championing that bill, because it really does deal with restrictive zoning, density, heights at transit hubs, and really mirrors what Assemblyman Chu has been successful in implementing in BART in some ways. And be interested on where you see the strengths and weaknesses, and as you move forward to try to kick that back into the Senate this year, how you see the opportunity in moving that forward.
Yeah, and thank you, David, for getting everyone warmed up. You know, it really is, we talk about zoning and TOD and all these technical terms, and it really is about banning apartment buildings. That's what this is all about. Communities that have said you can only build single-family homes here. We don't care if this is in the middle of a job center. We don't care if we're right on top of a major public transportation hub. Only single-family homes, period. And I grew up in a single-family home. I have nothing against single-family homes. This isn't about stopping people from living in single-family homes. But what we're talking about, let's be real, especially in areas like major swaths of West LA, San Francisco, much of the Bay Area, we're basically saying that unless you are wealthy enough to purchase a really expensive single-family home, you are not welcome in this neighborhood or in this city. You don't get to live by a BART station. You don't get to live by an LA Metro station. You don't get to live near downtown or Century City. You are out, because only someone who can buy a very expensive single-family home is allowed to live here. And we also need to be clear, we talk about affordable housing and all the wonderful work, for example, that LA is doing, the Bay Area is doing, investing in housing for low-income people. No one builds low-income, affordable, single-family homes. That's not like a real thing. You're going to build affordable housing for lower-income, working-class people. It is multi-unit. So when we allow cities to have exclusionary zoning and to ban apartment buildings near jobs, near transit, they are banning poor people. They are banning affordable housing. And we need to call it out for what it is. This isn't about going in and removing all the single-family homes. It's not what anyone's talking about. This is about saying, are we going to let people say, well, I have my single-family home that I like living in, and I don't want any apartment buildings in my neighborhood. Are we going to let people dictate that? We have historically in LA, in San Francisco, in other places, and it's not sustainable. Because what it means is that as we grow, this land that is around transit and near jobs, we're not allowing very much housing there. We're pushing people away. We're making poor people and middle-class people commute long hours and so forth. So SB 827 did not move forward this year. We knew that it was going to be hard in the first year. It was a big bill. I totally get it. There's a lot of misinformation that certain people were putting out, including people like Michael Weinstein, including the League of California Cities, and so misinformation spread. It was not as over the top as people were saying. We are now working very, very hard with our constructive critics for next year. There were people, particularly people on the equity side of things, people who are advocating for tenants, for affordable housing, who want to make sure we don't have displacement, which I fully support, and we did put some very strong affordability and anti-displacement provisions in the bill over the course of the legislative process. We are now working with a coalition, including in LA and the Bay Area, of equity advocates, affordability advocates, to recraft the bill and to grow the coalition. Because whether you are a YIMBY, whether you are an equity advocate, we all define ourselves with different labels. We all have enormous commonality in terms of wanting more housing at all income levels, wanting to avoid displacement. And our goal is early in the legislative calendar to come out with a strong bill with a very, very powerful coalition.
That's exciting to hear. Thank you for that leadership. So, Clyde, you've been one of the private sector leaders in talking about densification. I think last year you presented some very thought-provoking ideas about that if we densified 4% of our land mass here in Los Angeles, we can solve our housing crisis. He was also a big advocate of having the state really try to intervene to force local communities to develop land use policies that allow the acceleration and development of housing. You're one of the largest developers in Los Angeles of developing mixed-use communities. Can you kind of talk about, I know your production is down for 2019 compared to what you have had over the last number of years. I think you built a couple thousand units over the last 3 years and a little frustrated to where we are in the process today. Can you share kind of some of your thoughts on how we should attack the problem?
So first, I just need to tell you all what a wonderful support it is, Senator Wiener, in terms of really calling the issue as what it is, and being somebody who started my career at 3 Embarcadero in San Francisco, and really understanding the transportation needs and the housing needs in San Francisco. You know, Representative Chu, and moving 29, 23 forward. You know, we worked on Tree Commons, you know, for years, and seemingly, you know, running into significant roadblocks. Here's the issue. We have to come together as a people to say the 5% of our land mass around public transportation in the walkable urban core is open for business.
He increased it from, I thought it was 4, Clyde, but no.
Well, you know, hey, listen, you know, you're good for 10%, Brad. You know. If you take 4 or 5% of our land, if we can come together and say just 5% of our land is open for business, then what we can do is, from the private sector, create an opportunity to work together to say, how do we bring down our costs? How do we streamline the process in a way that actually reduces the cost of the next available unit? How do we leverage the investment of public dollars? Today, the LIHTC program, which has been a foundation for the affordable housing, is only producing 1/5 of the units it produced 20 years ago when it was first enacted. Most of that's because of red tape and the fact that cities don't want, they fight you tooth and nail to stop any ability of what's happening. So what I would say is, I think we view this as, we need a Marshall Plan for housing. We need to have a big conversation. Fully support the mayor's comments of housing is too expensive. We completely agree. Now, it doesn't help that we have tariffs on steel, and we're looking at a $4 increase for the cost of our high-rises. But actually, those costs pale in comparison to the cumulative nature of the costs that get forced onto the next available unit. And so what we've done here is provide a formula. When you look at it, when you analyze what is the nature of the policy, are we raising or lowering the cost of the next available unit? Because then if you do that, you raise it. If you look at CalPERS and CalSTRS, they require a 6% return in order to be able to get the money to build the project. Right. So if you raise the cost of the next available unit, whatever that cost is, and we've given an example here of $15,000, which is linkage and Quimby fees, that's $900 annually that project has to earn per unit that it didn't have to previously. That translates into less availability for financing. So because fewer units are built, rents rise faster. What's not understood is that when you raise the cost of the housing pyramid, you pass on that increase to the 870,000 renters in the city of Los Angeles. And so what happens, in order to collect, we think about 4,000 units will start next year, so there'll be about $60 million in linkage fees and Quimby fees, but it's costing the renter population, before you can get those projects built, $539 million comes out of the discretionary income for renters. And that's an annual charge where the linkage fees are only one time. So having a conversation together of how do we lower and streamline. One of the things that is incredibly frustrating, we worked on Sophia for 11 years. It took us to go from the time we bought the land till we opened the doors. On our project Angeline, just outside of West Hollywood, it was 14 years. And I was in my 40s, and I was very optimistic and going forward from that standpoint. And I have a partner in Seattle. He says, Clyde, you try that again, you won't be eating solid food by the time you get your, your projects done. So what we want to do is partner together and say, what can we do? Because we have all of the interests. We have the renters, we have labor. You know, appreciate the opportunity for the elements, but we need to be able to go up around transit. When you go up around transit, you can dramatically decrease your costs. We also, one of the things, an idea we have is to concentrate the bond cap, the 80-20 bond elements in the half-mile ring around transit, allowing affordable housing to have the additional 4% tax credits, to put housing where families with limited income have access to the best job markets without having to rely on a second car. Because it's the cost of transportation and the access to that transportation that is so burdening a lot of our families from that standpoint. And so what we would say is the most important thing we can possibly do is CEQA streamlining in walkable urban core and the half-mile ring around transit. It's simply not possible for the private sector to continue to spend years and years and millions of dollars on EIRs and spot zones and rezones and elements around walkable urban core and transit. We are never going to get there. So our view is we would like to see, and what we want to do is partner with our folks to take a Marshall Plan from the private sector, from all the low-income housing groups, et cetera, and go to Sacramento and put in front of the legislature a plan that will, from our standpoint, if we can eliminate the CEQA issues in those areas where we all know housing needs to be, we can eliminate the discrimination. What we would propose is 2-to-1 replacement for any units that are displaced, but having the ability to go up. We also would put forward an opportunity if a structure is more than 10 stories, because that's going to bring labor into the equation from that standpoint, that 10% of the property tax should come back to the city that enabled it in order to permanently fund very low and homeless housing. The state will have a huge benefit in terms of the property taxes on high-rises that come in that are being blocked today. And I conclude with saying the linkage fees are absolutely well-intended. We need to provide revenue sources, but revenue sources that are not going to raise the cost of the next available unit. We build a 400-unit high-rise on a half an acre. So 400 units at $15,000, that's a $6 million tax on a site, or $12 million an acre. We have no units to start next year because we're not competitive, because the landowner could build a hotel, they could build an office, they could do any other thing with it. And being put at a competitive disadvantage in exactly the places where we need to build density so that we can get cars off the road and we can bring in affordable housing, that's one of the things we need to help streamline. So we are 100% supportive of exactly what's happening here. We formed a coalition called Up for Growth that is bringing together all of these deals and the voice of the industry saying we've got to stop discriminating against families and folks who are in apartments. Time is now to do that.
That's good. Clyde always sets the bar really low. That's what I always love. But he's a person that's really spent a lot of money to really create some innovative ideas relative to how we can think outside the box, as he says, the Marshall Plan, and looking at what Assemblyman Chu and Senator Wiener are doing. There is an opportunity here to have a coalition of leadership that really does think outside the box to really address the emergency that we have with homelessness. And going to Robin. Robin, Abode Communities, as you all know, is over $600 million of investment, 2,900 units. One of the things that I think sets them apart as one of the leaders in affordable housing is that they're all about creating neighborhoods and taking individuals and creating a neighborhood and a community and providing really the social service that's required there to get people out of whether it's bridge or transitional housing or permanent supportive care that is critically important for us to address the poverty level, the individuals and the homelessness in particular in Los Angeles that are really struggling to pay the rent. And talk about how, what the discussion that we've heard from the three men sitting to your right as to what you need from the state. What do you think is the fix here to accelerate what you do?
Perfect, thank you. So first, I also just want to thank the Senator and the Assemblyman for their leadership in Sacramento. The fact that we got the 15 bills passed last year is because of champions like you, and it focused both on the entitlement piece, the land use piece, as well as unlocking the cash. So it's really great. So I want to thank you for your leadership. You know, as I've thought about this question, I have to say that I'm very optimistic about next year, you know, as we think about change in the governor as well as the continued leadership within the legislature. So that's what I want to speak to. And I think one of the key things that a new governor could do is to sort of proclaim a state of emergency around the housing and affordability.
Hear, hear.
And that comes with actions, because if there's a state of emergency, you get to take certain rules and sort of push them out the door and do creative, productive things. So one of the things that could be included in that is legislation that would allow, if a project qualifies for density bonus, meets all the requirements, just make it ministerial, and that could be for a 2-year period, so we get more housing produced out there. And that would create both market rate housing, but equally important, get those affordable housing units produced. We use the density bonus probably on most of the affordable housing that we build. The other thing that could be included in that, there were amendments to the Housing Accountability Act that has a sort of regulatory role if a project is not approved on a local level, that you can appeal to this entity. What I would suggest is to actually empower that, that through a board that a developer could appeal to actually have the project approved. So again, if you meet all of the local requirements, then your project should be approved. And that would include the bridge housing or the shelters that we've talked about as well. So I think that's a critical piece. I mean, we're constantly talking about the implications associated with costs. So perhaps during this time of emergency that there's legislation that prohibits any changes to state code that would impact the cost of the work that we do, as long as it's not a safety issue. So these are ways that within a short period of time that we can really get housing built quickly. But we have to continue to unlock the cash. So, the mayor spoke about Proposition 1, and there's also Proposition 2 on the ballot in about a month or so. And again, I want to thank the state legislature for that. But that is $6 billion that we can put into the production and preservation of affordable housing. So I want to encourage everyone in the room to support that. And again, that ranges from permanent supportive housing to housing people at 60% of median income. We've also heard that our state low-income housing tax credit program continues to be major demands for that. If we increase that by another $500 million, that would help in the production of affordable housing. So we get to marry these new dollars that are coming through the propositions with more tax credits out there. And we'll talk a little bit later, but I think, all of us talk about the demise of redevelopment and the implication that it's had, but it was really significant on the production of affordable housing. We saw both housing produced within 80-20 deals, but what we also saw was that housing increment that helped support the production of affordable housing. So we do need a tax increment financing that helps to support the production of affordable housing and the infrastructure associated with that. And then lastly, in cities like Los Angeles counties and up in the Bay Area, we've been fortunate to have enough votes to pass major bonds. But perhaps in other places where there's a need for affordable housing, we may not get there. So there could be a constitutional amendment to lower the thresholds for getting housing bonds passed at the local level, which I think would increase local revenues that are needed to produce affordable housing. So those are just some thoughts.
They're, well, actually great thoughts. And I think you touched on, Robin, the next subject that I'd love to hear everyone's opinion is, I think, Assemblyman Chu, you 3037 around redevelopment agencies, the reintroduction of targeted towards affordable housing and infrastructure. We obviously have the federal opportunity zones that everyone's trying to figure out what that really means. That came out as a part of the federal tax legislation and reform, and waiting for Treasury to understand how that's going to be implemented, if at all. And then the second is we had enhanced infrastructure districts, the EFIDs, which kind of didn't do a lot, candidly. But now there is this talk about how we attack and use tax increment for affordable housing. Love to hear your opinions relative to how that might pass in the next legislative. session.
Sure. The first thing is, Robin, all of those ideas are great. Where do you live? I want to run you for office. Talking about redevelopment, I think everyone knows that with the Great Recession, redevelopment agencies ended. And there was good reason at the time, given a number of abuses, given the cost and the recession. Governor Brown led the fight to eliminate the agencies. That being said, I'm certainly of the perspective that we threw a real housing set of babies out with the bathwater. And this past year, I had drafted a bill supported by a wide cross-section of Assembly members, and I want to just thank my LA colleagues, Miguel Santiago from downtown LA, Richard Bloom representing the Santa Monica area, Chris Holden representing the Pasadena area, who have been joint authors with me in the idea that we've got to bring back some version of tax increment financing. Sure. From our perspective, we don't think that spending tax increment on the economic development side, which was where most of the abuses happened in, when you read stories about monies going to golf courses and strip malls and mermaid bars, that is not what we are supporting. But we would like to see tax increment financing go specifically to affordable housing and basic infrastructure with measures in place to deal with abuses. I will also add to respond to something Robin said. I have introduced for 4 years in a row a significant increase to the affordable housing tax credit. It is woefully undersubscribed. And I love Governor Brown, but he vetoed the bill that we put on his desk that had received support, bipartisan, unanimous support from both the Republican and Democratic side to significantly increase financing that we know for every dollar we invest in an affordable housing tax credit, we leverage another $6 of federal, local, and private sector funding. So I am going to be reintroducing a bill, and it might so happen that the amount might be $500 million. And then the last thing I want to say is there is one segment of the housing market that I think has been completely missed by all policymakers. We focus on market rate. We focus on affordable, which we all know is really low-income affordable, and there's this whole vast missing middle, right? The housing we need for working families, for the folks, middle-class families who are our teachers, our first responders, our retail workers, all the folks who work for the companies that you represent. And I had proposed this year the idea that we should exempt property taxes for developers that are going to engage in missing middle production. And we can define what that is, but we've got to juice that part of the market. We've got to figure out how to juice every aspect of the housing market from the lowest to the top end, and I think that has to be a piece of it too.
Senator Wiener, any comment on redevelopment? Any comment on redevelopment agencies?
No, I want to commend Assemblyman Chu for restarting this conversation. We did throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I think bringing a more focused housing and infrastructure kind of redevelopment agency, redevelopment model back is important. I do want to also just comment on I agree the middle class gets left out frequently, and I look forward to that conversation. The challenge we have is, my view is, the market will not produce housing affordable to low-income people, at least in a good part of the state, which is why the subsidies are so important. For the middle class, I don't believe we're going to be able to subsidize our way out of the middle class housing problem. It's too big. It will cause a competition for funding between low-income housing and middle-income housing. And the ultimate solution to the middle class problem, I believe, is a pure supply problem that we just need to build a lot more housing while also having aggressive subsidies for lower income residents. I look forward to working with my colleague on what that model looks like.
I know gubernatorial candidate Gavin Newsom has talked about withholding infrastructure funds from cities that don't meet their housing goals. What's your thoughts, Clyde and Robin, and also the Assemblyman and Senator relative to that idea?
Yeah, again, I want to thank the legislature for what they've done in terms of trying to improve how housing elements are approached. But I do think that they continue to lack that sort of leverage, which is if you're not meeting your housing elements requirements, then these other sorts of subsidies that you want from the state, those are off the table too. So there should be both incentives, but perhaps now it's a time to look at what are some of the penalties, financial penalties if localities are not meeting their housing element.
So the idea of a stick, if you're not meeting your requirements, is got some merit. That said, transportation tends to be regional, and so if you have one city in the middle of a line that is not meeting their objectives and you're penalizing effectively those on the transit line or that element, it gets difficult. The question for us is really focusing the resources in an area so that you can clear multiple hurdles. CEQA and the half-mile ring around transit and the walkable urban core has to be dealt with because it's years, and all of the folks who want to stop. I mean, look, when I was here last year, you guys remember me in the devil outfit? You know, I'm bracing, you know, as somebody who's trying to provide housing, how I'm treated, you know, when I show up. But for $50, you can stop literally a $100 million project, and being able to take those arrows and continue fighting through that is very difficult. Yeah. But when you
just to think that we can have expedited CEQA litigation review for sports stadiums and we can't do it for housing, something's wrong there.
I completely agree. Here, here. So, you know, our goal and what we've challenged the city with is to come together. Let's do a Marshall Plan for housing. Let's take a bill to Sacramento and say, we would like to have expedited CEQA review for half-mile ring around transit, walkable urban core.
Absolutely.
We will agree 2-for-1 on displacement. 10% of the taxes in those areas in the state will be a huge beneficiary of revenue if we can unlock the ability to build in just that 5% of that area. It's enormous. We're visiting with the Fiona Ma, who's running for treasury. It's 3.4 million units that California is behind since 2010, according to our study. It was nice to see the UCLA study at 3.5, so we're kind of statistically right on the money.
There.
That's $20 billion a year in revenue that the state of California is losing because of the underinvestment in housing, and it's exclusively nailed down to people who don't want those people living in their neighborhood. It's wrong.
It is. Senator Wiener had a comment here. I wanted to...
Yeah, on this, what do you call it? A financial incentive to build more housing, or
Stick in the hammer.
Or a financial penalty if you don't. However, it's two sides of the same coin. You know, my view on this is that if we want more housing, which I think we do, if we want more housing, the way you get it is to allow more housing and to require that more housing be allowed, to have rules, to say you have to allow this housing. And that's really hard. We hear a lot of times from people, well, of course we need more housing, but you know, SB 827, that just goes too far. And we should do it more with, you know, with carrots and be nice, and that's not going to do it. You have to say what you want and then require it. My concern with withholding infrastructure money, in theory, maybe it could be good, but my concern is that in practice, here's what's going to happen. Wealthier communities are going to say, you know what, we hate housing so much. We don't want development, that we'll just pay it ourselves. You can take away our road money, we won't be happy, but we'll suck it up. And unless you make it some monumental amount of money, which we're not probably going to be able to do, then the wealthy communities will just suck it up. Low-income communities will not be able to suck it up because they don't have a financial alternative. In addition, when you start affecting public infrastructure by saying your community is not building enough housing, so we're going to take infrastructure money away, who are you hurting? You're disproportionately hurting low-income people.
Exactly.
That those low-income people are disproportionately relying on buses, relying on transit, and so forth. And those are the people who are, and I'll tell you, those are the lower-income, working-class people are not the ones who are getting their neighborhood associations to oppose development. They're not the ones who are spending 6 hours at the Planning Commission yelling about housing. They're busy working and putting food on the table and maybe commuting long hours because we haven't built housing for them. So I want to make sure that we're actually going to be doing what we need to do, and you do that by requiring more housing.
So I want to comment on Clyde's concept about land use around transit, and I think what I appreciated about it when he discussed it with me in the green room and other policies is that it accomplishes a number of things. One, it does get you to the production of affordable housing, but I think underlining any policy that is going to enhance land value and land use also has to have those inclusionary piece. So the replacement housing, the inclusion of affordable housing, and if you can build a mechanism, as he describes, that sort of helps to self-finance that affordable housing piece, that's incredible. So if we can think about broader statewide, and it could, hatch on to the one that you worked on for BRAD. If you could have a policy that encompasses all of those things, and that requires the production of affordable housing, I think is the key, or housing overall is the key.
As we're running out a little bit of time, I think I'd like to hear from each of you kind of one idea around this concept. I think if you look at LA County, 25% of our population pays an extremely, 71% of their income goes towards rent. So it creates this cycle of poverty. They're one paycheck away from being homeless.
Exactly.
To pay the average median rent of $2,400 a month, that means you need to make $45 an hour. We're just not there. And our issue here is this bridge transitional housing. You look at what each of the councilmen committed to in each of their districts was to provide transitional bridge housing and get that up and operating within 12 months of their commitment. And Herb Wesson just went through it, Councilman Wesson, Councilman Rue's going through it, huge opposition in their neighborhoods. What can we do either at the state level or the local level? One idea to help accelerate the bridge transitional housing in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Start with Robin, if you want.
Well, so very similar to the supportive housing ordinance that the City Council passed, if there could also be a bridge housing or shelter ordinance tied to their commitment to bridge housing. So it could take out of that, the process, the NIMBYism. So I think looking at trying to pass a bridge housing ordinance may help.
So I had the opportunity to meet Eric Garcetti 10 years ago when we were both presidents of our respective city councils, and we talked 10 years ago about just the irony of cities on the one hand saying we need to do something about homelessness, we need to do something about the housing crisis, and then in the same breath saying no to that project, not on that corner, not on that height. And there are two laws that Governor Brown just signed of mine that I'm hoping will directly address this. First, this is something the mayor alluded to. We, as of January 1st of 2019, because of a law Governor signed that I had authored, we will have by right for supportive housing in the state of California. We kept it fairly under the radar for obvious reasons, but FYI, folks, check it out. The second thing we did, and this was also something that was requested by a lot of housing advocates in LA in particular, is you've had a very peculiar rule in your Prop HHH, a letter of acknowledgement requirement that allows an individual city councilor to have a pocket veto on projects. And the rationale for that is individual city councilors ought to have the ability to negotiate and squeeze more out of developers. But for anyone who has been a local city councilor, Scott and I and Mr. Garcetti and others, we all know it's an incredible pressure point for your constituents, particularly your NIMBY constituents, to say, if you don't do what we want, we're going to recall you. And I could just fill in the blank of your LA city councilors who've been under that situation. And so we also move forward a rule that says that if any project is going to qualify for any state level funding, if a city has a letter of acknowledgement rule, that city's not going to get that funding. And that was because of advocacy of folks here in this room, and I want to just thank all of you who brought that to our attention. Our hope is that is going to also make it easier for these types of projects to move forward.
Clyde? Thank you.
So from a big idea standpoint, when you look at it, if we can come together and say, we're going to deal with CEQA and the half-mile ring around transit and the walkable urban core, if we can reignite the tax increment so that we can do the infrastructure necessary to get the density up in these areas around transportation, underbuilding our urban core, underbuilding our transportation is one of the biggest long-term risks that we have. Now, if you look at the federal program that produced the most housing that was affordable to workforce housing, it's the 80-20 bond program. Okay? We are advocating at the federal level that states that create a housing opportunity zone in the half-mile ring around transit and the walkable urban core will be able to qualify for unlimited 80-20 bonds, which offer tax credits for the affordable housing. So that the federal program can, in addition, can leverage the state dollars, and you can bring those two things together. The other element that we are advocating for is moving the 4% credit to a 9% credit to enable the credits to offset high-rise, because we need to put high-density, high-rise housing on transit that will support labor and living wage jobs. It will do more to create great jobs in those communities. It will take the most cars off the road because we're leveraging the public transportation. It'll also be the best way for the federal government to pair with the state resources to truly enable 20% of every project in the transit area to be affordable to people making 50% of AMI or less. Think about that. Those low-income families being able to access the best transportation and the best job markets without having to have a second car, which they spend 15% of their total income just to have a car to get to work. So the combination of bringing the programs together in a concentrated way is from our standpoint, it's the only thing we can see to really, truly head this off and make a meaningful change in what's happening.
We agree. Senator Wiener, closing us up.
Yeah, the streamlining of housing, and in this case of supportive housing, is really important. David's bill is great. We actually, for SB 35, because 97% of cities in California do not meet their very low housing goals, which includes supportive housing, SB 35, as we sit here today, 97% of the cities in California are streamlined for supportive housing. And David's bill took it to the next step, which is great to make that permanent for 100%. So I think we've taken steps to get to the point where we recognize that this housing is critically important. People, however much people don't like development in their community, they really rebel against things like supportive housing. And so I think it's incredibly important that as a team, we've now been able to put these protections in place statewide. But the next step is, and streamlining, is important. It's incredibly important. But the limit of streamlining is that if the zoning says you can't put multi-unit here, the streamlining doesn't get you very far. So whether we're talking about just a regular market rate apartment building or working class low income housing or supportive housing, if you don't have zoning for multi-unit, the streamlining doesn't get you very much at all. And that's why we have to pair streamlining with zoning reform.
Hear, hear.
So in closing, I'd like to have everyone really thank Senator Wiener and Assemblyman Chu for their leadership in Sacramento. Without them, we wouldn't be making changes. And in particular, with Robin and Clyde, because, again, their leadership is critically important from the private sector and the nonprofit sector to continue to help us address this critical situation. And thank you all for being here today. We appreciate it.
I want you to send me all your ideas.
Now on stage, our first spotlight session for today, Innovative Solutions to Addressing Homelessness with Lou Horn, President of CBRE, Southern California and Hawaii.